Can orcs wear space marine armor? What happens when the galaxy's deadliest scavengers find humanity's most sacred technology? The question seems absurd. Orks are brutal, primitive, fungal creatures who bash rocks together and call it engineering. Space marine armor represents 10,000 years of humanity's most sophisticated biomechanical achievement. The two shouldn't even occupy the same sentence, let alone the same battlefield. Yet across the blood-soaked worlds of the 41st millennium, Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests have documented something that makes their binary heart skip a beat. Ork Warbosses wearing ceramite plates torn from fallen Astartes. Greenskins stomping through war zones in armor that should reject them like a body rejecting a transplant. And somehow, impossibly, making it work. The implications shake everything the Imperium believes about technology, biology, and the green menace they've been fighting for millennia. See, the Imperium of man treats technology like religion. Every bolt, every plate, every fiber bundle muscle of space marine power armor represents sacred knowledge passed down through 10,000 years of careful preservation. The Adeptus Mechanicus guards these secrets with zealous fury, executing anyone who dares modify sacred templates. They don't understand how most of it works anymore. They just know the rituals, the prayers, the precise sequences that keep humanity's war machine grinding forward. And then you've got the Orks, a species that treats technology the way a toddler treats Lego blocks. They have no formal education, no scientific method, no engineering traditions whatsoever. They simply believe that red paint makes vehicles faster, that bigger is always better, and that anything can be made to work if you hit it hard enough. These two approaches to technology couldn't be more different. One demands reverence, ritual, and 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The other demands a wrench, some scrap metal, and absolute confidence that the universe will bend to orcish expectations. So when reports started filtering back about orcs wearing space marine armor, the Imperium did what it always does with uncomfortable truths. It suppressed them, classified them, pretended they didn't exist. But there's this one incident that couldn't be ignored. A forge world called Hexaplex Majoris, an Ork that overran an Adeptus Astartes garrison. When Imperial forces eventually reclaimed the world, they found something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. An Ork Warboss named Grimskull the Magnificent, wearing the modified armor of a slain Ultramarines Terminator. Armor that had been crudely expanded, painted garish colors, covered in orcish glyphs that pulsed with impossible energy. Armor that, by every law of technology and biology, should have crushed him the moment he climbed inside. It still functioned. If orcs can truly utilize space marine armor, it means one of two things. Either the Imperium's understanding of their own technology is catastrophically flawed, or the orcs possess capabilities that make them far more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. The Inquisition has suppressed this information for centuries, but truth has a way of emerging, especially when that truth comes wielding a power claw and screaming way at the top of its lungs. The truth requires a deep dive. Ork biology, the mechanics of space marine armor, the mysterious phenomenon of orcish belief-based technology, and ultimately, the answer to the question that keeps Imperial commanders awake at night. Can orcs wear space marine armor? The answer might terrify you, because if they can wear ceramite, what else can they claim? What other sacred technologies might fall into green hands? And what happens to humanity's only advantage in a galaxy that wants them dead? The answer lies ahead. Before an orc can wear the armor, one must understand what that armor actually is. And to do that, one must understand why the very question borders on heresy. Imagine a space so vast it is more void than sanctuary. This is the Armory Reclusium of the Phalanx, the legendary fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists. The air is thick with the scent of consecrated oils and the low thrum of power conduits that have sung their song for 10 millennia. Here, a newly inducted tech marine named Caius kneels. Before him, mounted on a maintenance scaffold, is a suit of Mark VII Aquila power armor. Its surfaces are a testament to history, a landscape of scars and scorch marks, each one a story of valor, each one a prayer answered in the crucible of war. Towering over Caius is brother Torvald, a senior tech marine whose own body is more machine than flesh. For 17 hours, they have been engaged in the sacred rites of awakening the armor's machine spirit. 17 hours of litanies, calibrations, and prayers to the Omnissiah. "The ceramite is but the skin, neophyte," Torvald's voice grates, a vox-processed rasp of binary and ancient Gothic. It is the vessel. The true power lies within. He gestures with a mechadendrite, its tip glowing with diagnostic light, toward the armor's exposed inner workings. Behold the electrofibers, artificial muscle bundles that will mirror your own. They will respond, not to your strength, but to your will, amplifying your every action fourfold. They will make you a god of war encased in holy steel. Through Torvald's instruction, the staggering complexity of the armor is revealed. It's not a suit, it's a self-contained ecosystem. Auto senses that process the visual spectrum from infrared to ultraviolet. A multi-lung that can filter the most toxic atmosphere or draw oxygen from water. A suite of chemical injectors ready to pump stimulants, painkillers, and combat drugs directly into the wearer's bloodstream. Dozens of servo systems, each requiring constant, prayerful calibration, lest a simple step become a bone-shattering miscalculation. But then Torvald reveals the critical detail, the one that makes the very idea of an orc wearing this armor an absurdity. "Power armor cannot be worn," he intones, the words carrying the weight of absolute law. "It must be bonded." He points to a series of recessed ports along the armor's inner spine and torso. These are the points of confluence, the sacred gates where flesh and machine become one. He is speaking of the black carapace, the final, most invasive implant given to a space marine, a subcutaneous, neuroreactive membrane that covers the warrior's entire torso, growing into his flesh and bone. Dotted across its surface are the very ports Torvald indicates, neural sockets that plug directly into the armor's systems. Without the black carapace, the armor is either a 200-kilogram coffin of dead metal or an uncontrollable mechanical beast that would crush its wearer's bones just by trying to walk. It is the bridge between man and machine, and only an Astartes possesses it. Caius reaches forward, his own augmetic fingers guiding the plugs into his own carapace. For the first time, he feels the connection. It's not a jolt of electricity, it's a flood. A tidal wave of information rushes into his consciousness. He feels the armor's reactor heart begin to beat in perfect rhythm with his own two hearts. He's aware of the armor's limbs, as if they were his own, phantom extensions of his will. He feels the weight, not as a burden, but as a part of himself. He understands viscerally why his brothers call this a second skin. As the final connection locks into place, Torvald delivers his final warning. The machine spirits of this holy armor are jealous entities. They bond with their wearers across centuries, learning their movements, anticipating their needs. An armor stripped from a fallen brother will resist a new wearer until it is properly reconsecrated. For a Xenos to attempt such a thing, it would not merely be technologically impossible, it would be spiritually catastrophic. The machine spirit would revolt. The systems would turn upon the filth within, and the sacred shell would become its tomb. At least, that's what the tech marines believe. The sacred rites of the Adeptus Mechanicus are all well and good. But on the other side of the galaxy, on a rust-red dust ball named Gorka Morka, technology is treated a little differently. The tone shifts from a reverent whisper to the deafening roar of a badly tuned engine. We leave the hallowed halls of the Phalanx and plunge headfirst into the chaotic, violent, saturated world of the Orks. Welcome to the workshop of Mech Boy Grocket. His shop isn't a building, it's a wound. The hollowed-out, scavenged corpse of an Imperial Thunderhawk gunship that slammed into the scrap fields decades ago. The air here doesn't smell of holy oils. It's a throat-burning cocktail of leaked promethium, sizzling metal, and the unmistakable musty funk of fungus beer. Grocket, a wiry orc with a complex and frankly dangerous-looking bionic eye that clicks and whirs of its own accord, embodies the orcish relationship with tech. He can't explain why his contraptions work, but they invariably do, in defiant violation of every known law of physics. His workshop is a museum of impossibility. Shutas made from exhaust pipes and scrap metal, a truck chassis with 3 different kinds of wheels that somehow drive straight, and a squig-powered toaster that has a kill count in the double digits. And there, in the darkest corner, suspended from groaning chains, is his masterpiece, the torso section of a Space Marine's power armor. Its once proud ultramarine blue is barely visible beneath layers of crude red paint, jagged glyphs, and the fresh, dripping oil from Grocket's latest adjustments. He remembers the day he got it, the whale, against the blue Umis on some forgotten agri-world. The fighting was glorious, a perfect symphony of Daka and Chappas, exactly as Gork and Mork intended. When the noise died down, the battlefield was a treasure trove, bolters, grenades, and the armored corpses of the fallen Space Marines. Most of the other boys just pried the Yumis out of their shells to get at the soft bits, tossing the armor aside. It was too fiddly, too small, and just not proper orky. But Grocket saw potential. He'd watch them move. He saw how the armor made them faster, stronger, how it seemed to know what they wanted to do before they did. Grocket wanted that. Or more accurately, he wanted to build it for whatever warboss had enough teeth to make it worth his while. He doesn't get bogged down with concepts like neural interfaces or black carapace requirements. That's Yumi thinking. Orky thinking is much more direct. The armor is too small for a proper orc? Get a bigger hammer and some extra plates. The armor needs weird Yumi flesh plugs to work? Rip 'em out and slap in some good orky wires. The armor's spirit is being a git? You show the spirit who's boss, usually with a combination of percussive maintenance and yelling. This isn't an isolated idea either. Across the galaxy, other mechs have been trying this for centuries. Most attempts end with a squished orc, an exploding power pack, or a suit that just freezes solid, trapping its new owner in a ceramite prison. But every now and then, one almost works, and those rumors travel. That's why he has a visitor today. The shadow that falls over his workbench isn't from a passing scrap hauler. It's a knob, but a knob who makes other knobs look like grots. He's huge, even for his rank, and his eyes burn with a cunning that's far more terrifying than simple muscle. This is Grimskull. I heard you was the mech what makes Yumi armor go, Grimskull rumbles, his voice like grinding rock. He gestures with a massive power claw toward the suspended torso. I heard a rumor about a boss in gold, a Terminator. I want one. Grocket's bionic eye whirs, calculating. This is the big one, the project that could make him a legend or a smear on the workshop floor. "It'll cost you," Grocket says, trying to sound braver than he feels. Grimskull grins, a terrifying vista of sharpened tusks. He kicks a heavy crate forward. It bursts open, spilling a fortune onto the grimy floor. 17 polished Yumi skulls, a crate of frag grenades still in their Imperial packaging, and more teeth than Grocket has seen in a year. "Dat," Grimskull says, "and I promise not to eat you when it blows up." Grocket looks at the pile of loot. He looks at the impossible challenge hanging from the ceiling. He looks at the ambitious, murderous glint in Grimskull's eye. He grins back. Done deal. After all, what's the worst that could happen? The narrative returns to the cold, logical heart of the Imperium, plunging deep into the bureaucratic horror that is the Adeptus Mechanicus's classified archives. Magos Explorator Helix 9, his biological components whirring softly in the sterile silence, has finally achieved his life's work. His investigation has led him to the vault of suppressed cognition on Mars itself, a repository for knowledge deemed too dangerous for general circulation, too valuable to destroy, and too heretical to ever acknowledge. The vault's architecture is a physical manifestation of its purpose, a non-Euclidean labyrinth of information-dense storage crystals suspended in shimmering stasis fields. Access requires clearances that few in the priesthood of Mars even know exist, and mental conditioning strong enough to withstand truths that can shatter sanity. Helix 9 spent 19 standard years petitioning for this access. Now, he stands before archives that will reshape everything the Imperium understands about Orkish capability. With a series of precise, ritualized gestures, he calls forth the first file. Report Alpha 7 Gamma, dated from the 38th millennium. During the purging of Volstis, inquisitorial forces discovered an Ork Warboss wearing the helmet of a fallen space wolf. The report's tactical pict captures are grainy, but the wolf pelt and runic etchings are unmistakable. More chilling is the attached analysis. The Ork demonstrated awareness of threats far beyond his normal visual range, suggesting the helmet's auto-senses remained fully operational. The Warboss was terminated with extreme prejudice, the helmet recovered for analysis, and every Imperial guardsman who witnessed the event was summarily mind-wiped. The helmet's post-mortem is a litany of blasphemy. The delicate internal circuitry was wrapped in crude copper wiring. Painted glyphs, meaningless to the machine god, covered internal surfaces. And lodged within the primary power distribution system, impossibly, was a dried squig heart. By every known principle of the Omnissiah, these modifications should have rendered the helmet inoperable scrap. They had not. Helix 9 feels a flicker of static in his logic processors, an emotion his augmetics struggle to classify as dread. He summons the next file. Report Beta 12 Sigma, 39th millennium. A raiding party of blood axes, the most cunning and unnervingly un-Orky of the major clans, was intercepted attempting to infiltrate an Imperial facility. They were wearing looted Astartes armor. The armor had been repainted in crude camouflage patterns, its sacred iconography defaced or stripped away. 3 of the 6 Orks wore suits that showed partial functionality, not full power, but enough for limited strength assistance, basic life support, and a primitive but working Vox link. The Orks were destroyed, but their leader escaped. In subsequent encounters, the blood axes demonstrated a marked improvement in their understanding of armor utilization. The knowledge was spreading. The final report Helix 9 dares to access is Gamma 3 Omega from the current millennium. The designation is Gutripa the Unstoppable. His warm against the Forge world of Metallica specifically targeted Astartes forces. Captured tactical recordings show Gutripa himself wearing what appears to be extensively, brutally modified Terminator armor, It functioned at approximately 40% of standard efficiency, but 40% of a Terminator is still a walking god of war. The armor permitted movement, provided protection against anti-tank weaponry, and powered a crude but devastating power claw integration. Gutripa was eventually killed by concentrated Night Titan fire, but not before he had single-handedly inflicted catastrophic casualties on 3 separate Space Marine chapters. Laying out the data slates, Helix 9's machine mind processes the terrifying pattern. This is not a series of isolated incidents. It is a learning curve. Early attempts were almost universally fatal failures. Recent attempts show growing sophistication and higher success rates. Something is fundamentally changing in how the greenskins interact with human technology, and the Mechanicum has no explanation that doesn't involve acknowledging concepts they have spent 10,000 years denying. Driven by a need for a unifying theory, he runs a deep archive search for correlated phenomena. One file appears. It is an anomaly, locked behind security protocols that make the rest of the vault seem like a public library. It references something called the wave field effect, and its primary thesis suggests that understanding Orkish technology might require abandoning the fundamental principles of the machine god's teachings. The file bears the seal of an Inquisitor Lord, now deceased, who spent his final years researching Ork phenomena. His conclusions were suppressed. His entire research team was executed for heresy. Helix 9 extends a mechadendrite. The decryption process begins. Its soft clicks the only sound in the tomb-like silence of the vault. The sound of a lock being opened and a nightmare being released. To understand if an Ork can wear the sacred shell of an Astartes, one must first understand what an Ork truly is. A biological horror unlike anything else in the known galaxy. This is the life's work of Genitor Primus Varla Crix, a Mechanicum biologist who has spent 6 decades studying the greenskin menace from her laboratory on the orbital research station Biologist Sigma. Her facility is a cathedral of grotesque science, containing hundreds of Orks in various states of preservation. Stasis tubes line the walls, holding freshly captured specimens frozen mid-roar, while ancient remains recovered from millennia-old battlefields are laid out on sterile plinths, their bones tagged with analytical markers. Crix's research, compiled across thousands of data slates, points to one terrifying fundamental truth. Orks are not a product of natural evolution. They are weapons, engineered during a forgotten age by a long-dead civilization to wage endless war across the stars. Every single aspect of their physiology reflects this singular, brutal purpose. Their cellular structure is an abomination, a symbiotic fusion of animal and fungal DNA that should be biologically impossible. Their blood, a thick, dark green ichor, contains photosynthetic compounds that allow them to derive nutrition from sunlight, reducing their dependence on food during extended campaigns. Their bones are not calcium-based, but a dense, cartilaginous material, flexible enough to absorb tremendous impacts, yet strong enough to support their massive, muscle-bound frames. Most significantly, Crix's work has revealed that Ork physiology is modular. Their bodies can integrate foreign biological material with frightening efficiency. She has autopsied specimens with grafted extra limbs, replaced organs, and even transplanted brain matter. Surgeries performed by Ork pain boys, with tools that are little more than cleavers and saws. A human patient would die of shock and infection on the table. The Orkoid immune system, however, doesn't reject foreign tissue. It incorporates it, adapting and modifying the transplanted material to serve the host body. This terrifying adaptability extends to non-biological material. Crix's research has documented Orks surviving and even thriving with crude mechanical augmentations that would cause fatal septicemia in any other life form. Metal plates are bolted directly to bone. Electrical systems are crudely wired into living nervous tissue. Bionics that lack any proper neural interface function perfectly, despite violating every principle of cybernetic integration. Ork bodies accept these modifications as though they were natural growths, and here lies the concept that has haunted Krix's research for decades. Orks don't merely survive augmentation, they improve from it. The most heavily modified orks, the cyborgs and meganobs, demonstrate capabilities that far exceed what their crude augmentation should provide. A simple piston-driven arm bolted to an ork's shoulder shouldn't function at all. Yet cyborgs wield such limbs with strength and dexterity that rivals proper mechanicum prosthetics. Krix's conclusion, an addendum to her official reports that she has suppressed for fear of excommunication, is that ork biology responds to a phenomenon beyond standard biochemistry. She has documented cases where identical augmentations produced wildly different results depending on the ork's mental state. Confident, aggressive orks saw their modifications function perfectly. Doubtful or timid orks experienced catastrophic failures. Their bodies, their very technology, function according to belief rather than physical law. The implications for space marine armor are chillingly clear. If an ork's body can adapt to crude mechanical parts through sheer force of will, then the technological sophistication of those parts might be entirely irrelevant. What matters is not the machine spirit, but whether the ork believes it should work. Her final, terrifying observation is locked in a private data vault. The orks are getting bigger. Each generation she studies is slightly larger, slightly stronger, slightly more resilient than the last. Something in their engineered biology responds to combat, accelerating their development. The more they fight, the more powerful they become. And they have been fighting humanity, uninterrupted, for 10,000 years. The single greatest obstacle, the absolute, categorical reason why an ork should never be able to wear space marine armor, is the black carapace. This is not a matter of size or strength. It is a biological and technological lock to which only an Adeptus Astartes possesses the key. To understand this impossibility, we follow Tech Marine Caius, several months into his training, as he assists in the solemn recovery of armor from a fallen battle brother of the Crimson Fists. The mission takes place on the soot-choked industrial world of Ferrum Prime, a graveyard where an ork incursion had claimed too many of humanity's finest. Caius's duty is a sacred and terrible one, to disconnect the armor from its deceased wearer. The process is a ritual of severance, requiring prayers to the Omnissiah as he cuts the neural links between the armor and the body. He can see the black carapace firsthand, a glistening, dark membrane that has grown to fill every interface port, its tendrils blurring the line between flesh and machine. With ritual blades, he severs these connections, and he swears he can feel the armor's machine spirit keen in electronic grief, a silent scream of loss as its bond with its marine is broken. Through this grim work, the full function of the carapace becomes viscerally clear. It is not just a plug, it is a second nervous system, providing direct neural control over the armor's every function. It grants the wearer real-time feedback from the suit's auto-senses, allowing a marine to feel the wind on a ceramite plate or the impact of a bullet as if it were their own skin. It facilitates autonomous responses, the armor systems reacting to threats before the wearer is even consciously aware of them. Without the black carapace, trying to operate power armor would be like trying to pilot a battle tank by kicking it. The suit's immense weight and uncontrolled servo systems would fight the wearer's every move, turning the sacred shell into a dead-weight coffin that would grind their bones to dust. It is during the return journey that Caius is assigned to debrief Brother Sergeant Orthos, a veteran who survived 3 weeks in Ork captivity. Orthos's words are halting, his gaze distant, haunted by something worse than simple violence. He describes watching the greenskins try to wear the armor stripped from his fallen brothers. Most attempts ended just as Imperial doctrine predicted, in gore and ruin. The Orks were crushed, their bodies mangled by the unpowered weight and uncontrolled machinery. But one attempt, the one that now lives in Orthos's nightmares, was different. He describes a single mech boy who spent days working on a damaged Mark VI suit, one missing its helmet and an arm. The Ork didn't just modify it, he talked to it, a constant stream of guttural, nonsensical babbling. He painted crude symbols on its surfaces with squig dye, hammered new, incompatible components into its frame, and finally, impossibly, climbed inside. And the armor moved. It was jerky, clumsy, a horrific parody of Astartes' grace. But it moved. It responded to the Ork's commands without any neural interface, without any black carapace, without anything but the mech boy's deranged conviction. The Orks weren't solving the black carapace problem with technology. They were simply ignoring it. They were bypassing the most fundamental law of Astartes' wargear through sheer, unadulterated force of will. The implication terrifies Orthos more than any charging greenskin. If they can make human technology work by believing it should, then no weapon, no defense, no sacred machine is truly beyond their grasp. Upon returning to his chapter, Caius includes Orthos's testimony in his report, expecting concern, perhaps even a full inquisitorial investigation. Instead, his superior glances at the file, his expression unreadable. He simply notes that such reports of Xenos-induced battlefield hallucinations are common among those with prolonged Ork exposure. He recommends Orthos for immediate psychological reconditioning. The knowledge is suppressed. The truth is ignored, as it has been for centuries. After 19 years of petitions and 17 hours of decryption rituals, the data crystals from the vault of suppressed cognition finally yielded their secrets to Magos Helix 9. The information did not flow like a stream, but bled like a wound, tainting everything he thought he knew. It came from the work of a ghost, an inquisitor lord named Hezekiah Stroud, executed 40 years prior for technology heresy and what the verdict called dangerous, unprovable speculation. Stroud had spent his life studying the greenskin menace, and his conclusions were so terrifying, so fundamentally heretical, that the Inquisition chose to erase the man rather than engage with his findings. Stroud's research gave a name to the madness, the Wa field. It was his term for the collective psychic energy that every Ork in the galaxy generates, a low-level, ambient hum of psychic potential that is utterly distinct from the focused abilities of a human psyker. This field, Stroud proposed, responds to the raw, unfiltered belief of the Orks. It subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, alters reality to match what the greenskins collectively expect to happen. The effect is almost undetectable with a single Ork, but when they gather in numbers for war, their combined conviction creates a force that can bend the laws of physics. The decrypted files were filled with hundreds of documented examples that defied all logic. Stroud had cataloged Ork vehicles, trucks, that continued to function perfectly, despite lacking engines, fuel lines, or even coherent drive shafts. They moved because the Orks driving them and the boys riding in them all believed that red wounds go faster. He had dissected Ork firearms, shootas, that were nothing more than solid chunks of metal with a trigger mechanism and a barrel, yet they fired projectiles with devastating force because the Orks holding them believed they should. He even had medici reports from a pain boy's Doc's Hop, where an orc survived having his heart replaced with a live, enraged squig, because both the doctor and the patient were absolutely certain that orcs are just dead-ard. The WA field doesn't create something from nothing. It doesn't violate the conservation of energy in a way the Mechanicum's instruments could measure. Instead, it plays dice with the universe, loading them in the orc's favor. It influences probability. A poorly welded gun that should jam after a single shot will, in the hands of a confident orc, fire flawlessly, because the WA field nudges every microscopic variable: the seating of the round, the temperature of the propellant, the friction of the bolt, towards a successful outcome. In human hands, lacking the field's influence, that same gun would explode on the first trigger pull. Stroud's most damning observation was that the field intensifies with confidence, creating a terrifying feedback loop. An early success for a mech boy breeds confidence. That confidence strengthens the WA field around him, which makes his next, more ambitious project more likely to succeed. That success breeds even greater confidence. The orcs are not just learning. They are becoming more capable because they believe they are. The implications for Space Marine armor struck Helix 9 with the force of a physical blow. An orc doesn't need to understand the black carapace. He doesn't need to know the 17 litanies of activation for a machine spirit. He only needs to believe, with the absolute, bone-deep certainty only an orc can muster, that the armor will work for him. The WA field will then bend probability to make it so. Neural links that should reject Xenos biology will find a way to accept it. Power systems that should overload will stabilize. A machine spirit that should revolt in fury will be psychically bludgeoned into compliance. The armor will function. Not perfectly, not with Astartes' grace, but it will function. And as Helix 9 stared at the final, damning lines of Stroud's research, a thought so blasphemous it threatened to short-circuit his own cogitators took root. The sacred rituals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the anointed oils, the binary prayers, the appeasement of the machine spirit. What if it was all just humanity's own, pathetic, structured version of the WA field? What if technology didn't work because of the rituals, but the rituals worked because they created belief, and it was belief that made the machines obey? The thought was heresy. It was the end of his entire world. The rise of a warboss begins not with a whisper, but with a roar. For Grimskull, that roar echoed in the cavernous feasting hall of his warband, a space carved from the belly of a crashed orc cruiser. The air was thick with the stench of fungus brew and roasted squig, the din of 100 greenskins celebrating a recent easy raid. At the head of it all sat Warboss Gorrigut, a mountain of scarred green muscle, his gut spilling over the top of his iron trousers, bloated and slow with victory. Grimskull, then just a knob, watched him from the shadows, his ambition a cold, hard knot in his chest. Gorrigut's complacency was a weakness, a disease. Fewer proper fights meant less growth, and in the brutal calculus of orc society, less growth meant eventual death at the hands of a hungrier tribe. Grimskull's challenge was a masterpiece of orcish cunning. He didn't wait for a formal duel. He struck in the middle of the feast, when Gorrigut was at his slowest. He positioned himself near the mech boys' corner, knowing their unpredictable contraptions could serve as a useful distraction or backup. He didn't charge head-on. He lunged, his movements shockingly fast for his bulk, and his first target wasn't Gorgut's chest or throat, but his eyes. A sharpened piece of scrap metal, held in his offhand, raked across the warboss's face, blinding the larger brute in a spray of dark green ichor before the real fight even began. The hall erupted. Gorrigut roared in pain and fury, swinging blindly, his massive choppa cleaving a stone table in two. The fight was a maelstrom of violence. Grimskull absorbed punishment that would have turned a human to paste. A glancing blow from Gorrigat's fist broke 3 of his ribs. A wild kick punctured an organ. But he kept moving, kept fighting, driven by a clarity of purpose that transcended mere instinct. This wasn't just a brawl for dominance. It was the execution of a plan. He was not just stronger, he was smarter. When Gorrigat finally stumbled, disoriented and bleeding, Grimskull brought his power claw down again and again, until the Warboss's skull collapsed with a wet, final crunch. Silence fell. Grimskull stood over the corpse, breathing heavily. He didn't preen or posture. He immediately turned to the stunned warband. Gorrigat was weak, he bellowed, his voice raw. He was happy with scraps. I ain't. We're going to the shiny forge. He pointed a claw toward the void. The Umis call it hexaplex majoris. They make the good stuff there. The armor, the guns. We're gonna take it all. This was what made Grimskull different. Most orcs fought because fighting was fun. Grimskull understood that proper equipment made fighting more fun. He had watched the Yumi bosses in their gleaming armor, how they waded through hordes of boys that should have overwhelmed them. He wanted that power, not to be like the Yumis, an unthinkably un-orky notion, but to take what made them strong and make it bigger, better, and greener. His inner circle was already in place. Mech Boy Grocket, whose workshop was a testament to impossible engineering. Pain Boy School Cruncha, who could stitch an orc back together with anything he could find. And Weird Boy Zogwart, whose crackling psychic energy would be the key. Grimskull knew that claiming the Yumi's sacred armor wasn't just about power, it was about becoming a legend. The greatest warbosses wore mega armor forged from scrap. Grimskull would wear armor forged from the shells of humanity's greatest warriors, claiming their strength and their story for his own. The Wave departed within the week, a fleet of ramshackle ships that defied physics, held together by rust, prayer, and the sheer collective belief that Orky ships don't need to make sense, they just need to fly. War was coming to the Forge world, and with it, an experiment that would change everything. Hexaplex Majoris was not a world, but a machine the size of one. Its original geography, its mountains and oceans, were a forgotten myth, buried beneath 100 centuries of relentless construction. From orbit, it was a ball of tarnished iron and flickering lights, its atmosphere a permanent, toxic shroud of industrial smog that choked the stars. Kilometers-high hive spires clawed at the perpetually gray sky, their cavernous interiors housing billions of souls, whose only purpose was to feed the Imperium's insatiable hunger for the tools of war. The air tasted of ozone and hot metal, and the ground trembled with the ceaseless rhythm of continent-spanning manufactorums. This world had a singular, sacred purpose. It was one of the primary producers of power armor components for the Adeptus Astartes. At the heart of this planetary engine resided Archmagos Syntax 7. For 400 years, she had been the ranking authority on Hexaplex Majoris, and the world was an extension of her own body. What little of her original flesh remained, a shriveled brain and spinal column floating in a nutrient-rich vitrine, was the least important part of her. Her consciousness resided in the data streams, her will executed by the millions of servitors and skitari that patrolled her domain. She was ancient, logical, and utterly certain of the perfection of her systems. That certainty was on full display in Manufactorum Primus, where Captain Titus Vero of the Ultramarines' 4th Company stood witness to the rite of consecration. Newly forged pauldrons and greaves, destined for his chapter's armory, were being anointed with sacred oils by chanting tech priests. The air was thick with incense and the crisp scent of binary canticles. The Alliance was a cornerstone of the world's security, The Ultramarines received priority access to the world's output in exchange for the permanent garrison of 100 battle brothers. For 3 decades, Captain Varro had overseen this duty, and the ritual, once profound, had become routine, a symbol of an order so stable it had forgotten how to be threatened. Later, in her data sanctum, a warning flickered across one of Syntex 7's 1,000 monitors. Auspex returns from the system's edge. An Ork fleet, small, disorganized. The Archmagos processed the information in picoseconds. Ork raids were a statistical constant in this segmentum. The world's defenses were absolute. 7 Titan legions on rotation, uncounted Skitarii cohorts, and void shields that could shrug off a fleet action. She analyzed the approaching fleet's mass, energy signatures, and trajectory. The threat assessment was negligible. "Authorize standard defensive protocols," her synthesized voice echoed in the sanctum, a command relayed to 1,000,000 different systems at once. "Return to production schedule." The green-skinned menace was a nuisance, not a threat. Miles above, on the bridge of a stolen Imperial cruiser, crudely renamed DA Biggest Git, Grimskull watched the jewel of Hexaplex Majoris grow on the main view screen. The ship's bridge was a chaotic mess of sparking wires, bolted-on armor plates, and loud, agitated orcs. But Grimskull was calm. He could feel the Yumis watching him. He could feel their arrogance, their certainty. They thought they knew orcs. They thought this was just another raid, another wave of mindless violence to be swatted away. They were wrong. "Boss, we're in range of their big guns," a knob grunted, gesturing a claw at the glowing planet. "Time for a proper scrap." Grimskull didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the system chart. He pointed a massive, armored finger, not at the planet, but at the smallest of its 3 moons, a barren, pockmarked rock with no strategic value and minimal defensive presence. "Take us there," he ordered. The knob looked confused, but a low growl from Grimskull silenced any protest. The Ork fleet, to the utter bewilderment of Imperial observers, veered away from the Forge world and began a slow, deliberate approach to the useless moon. On the command deck of the Ultramarine strike cruiser, the officer of the watch logged the maneuver with a note. Xenos fleet exhibiting characteristically illogical behavior. Grimskull watched the distant, glittering world, a jagged smile spreading across his face, revealing far too many teeth. The Yumis didn't understand. The moon wasn't the target. It was the staging ground. The landing on Hexaplex Majoris's 3rd moon was, to Imperial observers, an act of breathtaking stupidity. The moon was a dead rock, a husk of exhausted mineral deposits, and abandoned mining facilities. It held no strategic value whatsoever. Reports noted the deployment with a kind of clinical contempt. It was more proof of orcish mindlessness, an inability to distinguish a worthless target from a valuable one. To confirm this assessment, a squad of Ultramarines reconnaissance specialists was dispatched. Squad Lucianus deployed via drop pod. Their mission simple: observe, report, and confirm the enemy's incompetence. They expected to find a disorganized Ork encampment, a pointless foothold on a barren world. What they found challenged every assumption they held about their ancient foe. The Orks weren't building a crude camp. In a deep, hidden crater, they were constructing something else. Massive, circular platforms of humming scrap metal, crackling with barely contained energy. Their surfaces covered in glyphs that seemed to writhe in the low light. They were teleporta platforms, a blasphemous orcish perversion of sacred Imperial technology, made functional only through the sheer force of their collective belief. And they were aimed not at the planet below, but at a precise set of coordinates in high orbit. Coordinates that corresponded directly with their own strike cruiser. The realization came a second too late. The Orks had known they were coming. From the shadows of derelict mining equipment, figures emerged. Commandos. blood-axe specialists who valued cunning and stealth over the straightforward brutality of their kin. The fight was a desperate, foregone conclusion. The Ultramarines were masters of the prepared battlefield, but here they were the ones caught in a trap. Bolter fire was answered by a storm of crude but effective slugs. A chainsword met a power claw, and the chainsword lost. Sergeant Lucianus, his armor breached and his lifeblood leaking into the lunar dust, managed to key his Vox for a single, fragmented transmission. Ambush, teleporta targeting, Sword of Guilliman. They knew. The report ended in a wet crunch as a power claw descended. On the bridge of the Ultramarine strike cruiser Sword of Guilliman, the warning was still being processed when reality tore itself open. The ship's void shields, designed to repel torpedoes and lance batteries, flickered and failed. They were not built to stop matter transmission from the inside out. With a nauseating shimmer of green lightning, hundreds of Orks materialized throughout the vessel. They appeared in the main cargo holds, in the echoing halls of the engine rooms, and on the command bridge itself. The boarding action was savage. Space Marines, the finest warriors in the Imperium, found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who had appeared from nowhere. The metallic corridors rang with the roar of bolters and the guttural war cries of the greenskins. But the Orks were not trying to capture the ship. They fought with a terrifying and uncharacteristic precision, ignoring vital command centers in favor of specific, secondary systems. Life support, navigation, and most critically, the hallowed armor maintenance shrines, where the company's reserve suits and salvaged components were stored. Captain Vero, his face a mask of cold fury, led a counter-assault that eventually cleared the bridge, but the cost was staggering. 17 of his battle brothers were dead, twice that number wounded, and his ship was crippled. Yet the loss of life was overshadowed by the material devastation. The armor shrines had been looted, not destroyed, but methodically stripped of their contents. The Orks hadn't attacked the Sword of Guilliman to destroy it. They had attacked it to steal from it. The true genius of Grimskull's plan was only revealed in the attack's aftermath. While the boarding action had consumed the Ultramarines' attention and drawn the entire planet's gaze to the battle in orbit, the main Ork force had launched from the moon. Their trajectory was not toward the primary hive spires or the grandest manufactorums. They descended upon a secondary installation on the planet's far side, Fabrication Complex Zeta 9, a facility where damaged, often irrecoverable, Space Marine armor was sent for reclamation. In her sanctum, Archmagos Syntex 7 received the casualty reports. The complex had fallen, its Skitarii defenders overwhelmed before any reinforcements could even be dispatched. The Orks had breached the walls and vanished into the facility's depths, taking their prizes with them. They had seized the broken, battle-scarred remains of dozens of Space Marine armor suits, relics accumulated over decades of salvage operations, armor the Mechanicum considered beyond repair, but could never bring itself to destroy. Grimskull had what he came for. He had his raw materials. The captured fabrication complex Zeta 9 had been remade. What was once a sterile, sanctified hall of the Adeptus Mechanicus was now something between a workshop, a scrapyard, and a religious shrine to violence. Mech-boy Grocket had claimed the facility's central repair bay as his personal domain. He was surrounded by his most trusted spanners, his mech-boy assistants, and enough salvaged power armor to equip a small crusade. The air, once filtered to molecular purity, was now thick with welding smoke, the ozone tang of arcing electricity, and the ceaseless guttural chatter that accompanies all Orkish works of creation. Grocket began his masterpiece with an approach that set him apart from his peers. Where other mech boys relied on pure, chaotic instinct, Grocket had developed something that bordered on a methodology. He called it getting it right, and it involved 3 stages: assessment, modification, and convincing. Assessment began with the most obvious problem. The armor was too small. Even the largest suits, designed for the transhuman giants of the Adeptus Astartes, were built for a fundamentally human frame. Orks were broader, heavier, with different joints, and a lower center of gravity. Simply climbing inside was impossible. The solution required cutting the sacred ceramite apart, adding new material, and somehow maintaining structural integrity. But the armor fought back. Grokit perceived its machine spirit not as a holy consciousness, but as a stubborn, angry metal Git would don't want to work proper. Tools would break against its surface for no reason, welds would fail to take, and power systems would short-circuit with spiteful glee. The modification stage was a masterclass in Orkish problem-solving. Grokit didn't try to make the armor work like Yumi armor. That was a fool's game. He made it work like Orky armor. He tore out the delicate fiber-optic neural interface systems, replacing their elegant complexity with crude, heavy-duty mechanical linkages. Thick pistons and pressure plates would respond to the wearer's brute physical force, not their thoughts. He widened the torso by welding on thick plates of salvaged tank armor, the new metal forming a crude but effective patchwork. The leg systems were completely rebuilt around Orkish proportions, sacrificing the Astartes' fluid grace for raw, stomping strength. Finally came the convincing. To a human, it was superstition. To an orc, it was practical engineering. Grokit painstakingly painted specific glyphs onto the armor's surfaces, jagged symbols representing Orkish concepts of immense power, blinding speed, and absolute toughness. He talked to the armor constantly, a stream of threats and promises explaining exactly what he expected it to do. For the most critical step, he had his grots, the small, servile Orkish underclass, nervously touch key components. Their terrified belief that Da Boss's new armor is the killiest thing ever was a vital ingredient, adding their psychic resonance to the growing collective expectation. The first full test ended in disaster. One of Grokit's most eager spanners, a burly orc named Grislog, donned a prototype conversion. For a moment, it worked. The armor activated with a roar, its limbs responding to Grislog's crude movements. He took a single, triumphant step. Then, something went wrong. The power system surged uncontrollably. The servos locked in a dozen random configurations at once. With a series of sickening crunches and shrieks of tearing metal, the spanner was crushed within the suit as it tore itself apart from the inside. Grokit studied the mangled wreck, not with sorrow, but with intense focus. He understood the problem instantly. Grislog hadn't believed strongly enough. He was afraid of the armor, secretly uncertain it would work, and the Weah. Field had responded to that doubt by making his fears manifest. The armor required more than just physical modification. It demanded absolute, unwavering psychological commitment. As the failed prototype was dragged away, Grimskull entered the workshop. The warboss observed the scene without comment, his presence silencing the remaining chatter. He walked past Grokit and approached the armor being prepared specifically for him. A suit of Terminator armor, expanded to monstrous proportions, its imperial eagles defaced with a painted skull, its gold trim replaced with dull, orcish bronze. He laid a massive green hand on its chest plate. Grokit swore he saw the armor respond. A single status light flickered to life. A low, resonant hum vibrated from the power core, a sound of awakening. Grimskull believed. And that, Grokit knew, would make all the difference. The response to the crisis on Hexaplex Majoris was by any rational measure overwhelming. 3 additional Space Marine chapters answered the call. The cold logic of the Iron Hands, the stoic fury of the Imperial Fists, and the righteous zeal of the Black Templars. Each committed a full company. The Astra Militarum mobilized 4 regiments of its elite Tempesta scions. On the Forge world itself, 3 dormant Titan legions were awakened from their centuries of slumber, their machine spirits roused by frantic prayer and binary cant. This immense force gathered for a strategic council aboard the Imperial command ship, the Triumph of Faith. On its vast bridge, hololithic representations of war machines flickered as the leaders of humanity's might argued over jurisdiction, priority, and the proper application of force. Captain Vero of the Ultramarines, his chapter's pride still bleeding from the ambush that cost him brothers and sacred war gear, argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault on the captured complex. He was countered by Iron Father Carden of the Iron Hands, his voice a dispassionate synthesis of flesh and steel. "The priority is recovery," Carden stated, his optical sensors fixed on the data slate displaying captured armor schematics. "The captured technology represents millennia of accumulated knowledge. It cannot be allowed to remain in Xenos hands, nor can it be risked in a haphazard assault." Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars scoffed, his gauntleted hand clenching into a fist. "The only proper response to Xenos desecration is total, uncompromising annihilation. We will purge the greenskin from this world with sword and flame. Tactical nuance is a luxury we cannot afford." The deeper conflict was clear. These forces were allies in name only. Each chapter held to its own doctrines, its own chain of command. The Mechanicum representatives cared more for recovering their holy technology than for eliminating the Orks who had stolen it. The Astra Militarum officers stood silently, accustomed to being dismissed by the transhuman arrogance of the Astartes. Into this deadlock stepped Inquisitor Helena Vance. An agent of the Ordo Xenos, she had spent 50 years studying Orkish phenomena, and she did not share the commander's casual disdain for the enemy. She had read the suppressed reports. She knew of the "we" field. She recognized that Grimskull's behavior suggested a dangerous alien intelligence. She attempted to warn them. "This Ork is different," she said, her voice cutting through the arguments. "His tactics are not typical. Standard suppression strategies may prove inadequate." Her words fell on deaf ears. The assembled commanders had fought Orks 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds. They knew the enemy. Orks were brutal, numerous, and dangerous, but they were also predictable. They attacked in waves, relied on brute force, and dissolved into infighting when their warboss fell. Kill Grimskull, and the Wah would end. The problem was simple. The solution was direct. Vance's private concerns ran deeper. She had reviewed every scrap of data from the initial attacks. Grimskull could have raided any number of less defended worlds for salvage. He specifically chose Hexaplex Majoris, a world producing new armor. He targeted the repair complex, where the most complete, though damaged, suits would be stored. His tactics showed planning, anticipation, and objectives that went far beyond simple looting. He wasn't just stealing junk, he was gathering ingredients. This was the fundamental obstacle to Imperial success: institutional arrogance. Every commander present assumed they understood the threat, that their vast experience encompassed anything the Orks might attempt. This assumption had guided humanity's response to the Green Tide for 10,000 years, and it had generally proven adequate. But it required the Orks to remain what the Imperium expected them to be, and Grimskull was becoming something else entirely. The council ended. The decision was made. A combined, overwhelming assault would be launched. Dozens of vessels descended on Fabrication Complex Zeta 9, carrying thousands of warriors and war machines. The attack was irresistible by any conventional measure. It was also, as Inquisitor Vance suspected, with a cold knot of dread in her stomach, exactly what Grimskull had been waiting for. The Imperial assault on Fabrication Complex Zeta 9 was a textbook display of overwhelming force. They approached the captured facility expecting a brutal siege, a war of attrition against fortified Ork positions, and endless waves of green-skinned defenders. Instead, they found something deeply unsettling. Silence. Scouts reported minimal resistance, half-finished fortifications, and clear signs of a hasty evacuation. The commanders on the Triumph of Faith quickly reached a consensus. Grimskull, faced with the assembled might of 4 Space Marine chapters and 3 Titan legions, had fled with his loot, abandoning the complex rather than face annihilation. This interpretation seemed confirmed when Captain Vero's Ultramarines breached and secured the central repair bay. The vast chamber was a scene of Orkish desecration. Crude welding marks and garish glyphs defaced the sacred armor plates that remained. But crucially, most of the salvaged equipment was still there, apparently abandoned in the retreat. A wave of relief washed over the Imperial command net. Captain Vero, standing amidst the defiled technology, broadcast his report across the Vox. Victory. The Xenos threat was neutralized. The trap activated 30 minutes later. From hidden tunnels beneath the industrial sprawl, from camouflaged positions within seemingly abandoned manufactorums, the Orks emerged. Grimskull had never intended to hold the repair complex. He had used it as bait, drawing the full weight of the Imperial assault into a perfectly prepared killing field. As thousands of Orks swarmed the Imperial flanks, the sky above the battlefield lit up with sickening, non-Euclidean flares. Teleportus, activated from the moon base the Imperials had dismissed, tore through reality, vomiting fresh waves of Ork warriors directly behind the Imperial lines, severing supply chains and savaging command structures. The disciplined assault dissolved into a maelstrom of confused, desperate fighting. Space Marines, the masters of tactical warfare, found themselves engaging enemies that materialized from thin air, responding to threats from impossible directions. The mighty Titans, gods of war, advanced through manufactorum corridors too narrow for effective maneuvering. Their void shields scraped against reinforced walls as Ork tank boostas, hidden in prepared positions for weeks, struck at their vulnerable joints. The Tempestus Scion regiments, lacking the transhuman senses of the Astartes, suffered devastating casualties as commando squads infiltrated their lines, their crude blades slitting throats in the smoke and confusion. Through it all, Captain Varo fought with a growing, sickening horror. He had been played. Every tactical assumption that had guided his deployment, every piece of doctrine concerning Orkish warfare, had proven catastrophically wrong. This enemy thought beyond the typical greenskin parameters. They were not fighting like Orks. They were fighting like an enemy who understood precisely how humans expected Orks to fight. Varo rallied his surviving company and pushed toward what intelligence marked as Grimskull's command post, determined to salvage this disaster by slaying its architect. His assault team blew the doors off the designated command center and stormed inside. They found no war boss. Instead, a lone, twitching figure waited for them. The weird boy Zogwart. As bolters leveled on him, the psyker cackled, his voice dripping with psychic energy and contempt. "The boss sends his thanks," Zogwart rasped. "Hopes you boys enjoyed the show." At that exact moment, across Hexaplex Majoris, the rest of the plan reached its climax. While the might of the Imperium was focused on Zeta 9, smaller, specialized Ork forces had struck dozens of secondary targets. Communication relays, supply depots, ammunition stores. The most critical target was the Planetary Defense Coordination Center, the integrated network that directed Titan movements, coordinated orbital fire, and maintained void shield coverage went dark, systematically and brutally sabotaged. And then came the final, horrifying revelation. During the chaos, a single elite Ork squad had infiltrated the primary production facility. Their goal was not destruction, it was theft. They breached the data vaults. The entire battle, the thousands of lives lost, the feints and ambushes. It was all a grand distraction. Grocket needed specific technical specifications to complete his work on Grimskull's armor. Information about power distribution, joint articulation, the precise tolerances of sacred systems. The war was never about territory. It was about knowledge. Imperial forces were in disarray, their chain of command shattered, their coordinated assault a fragmented mess. They had faced a war boss who could think strategically, who could plan complex, multi-stage operations, who could anticipate and exploit their every response. The implications were more terrifying than any Ork charge, but the true horror was just beginning. While the fires of war raged across the industrial plains of Hexaplex Majoris, a different kind of battle was being waged in the depths of the Ork-held territory. Far from the fighting, protected by layers of guards and scrap metal barricades, lay the workshop of Painboy Skullcruncha. It was a place of intimate horror that would have driven any human observer to madness. Operating tables, fashioned from plundered machinery, were permanently stained with the ichor of 100 different patients. Surgical implements ranged from crude, sharpened cleavers to disturbingly precise instruments looted from medici facilities. Along the walls, jars held a grotesque library of biological samples, organs, limbs, and stranger things, representing Skullcruncha's long and bloody career of modification and experimentation. Into this sanctuary of pain walked Grimskull. He approached the operating table with the unique fatalism that characterizes the Orkish attitude toward danger. The work of a pain boy was inherently risky. For every successful augmentation, another patient died on the table, and many survivors emerged with unexpected, often unwanted modifications. But the potential reward justified any risk. Grimskull's belief in his own destiny was absolute, carrying the weight of prophecy. He would survive this surgery because he had to. Skullcruncha began his work. The first step was to install the crude equivalent of the black carapace's interface ports. The pain boy peeled back sections of Grimskull's thick green hide, exposing the muscle and bone beneath, and bolted metal plates directly into the flesh. These plates wouldn't provide the sophisticated neural link that Space Marines enjoyed, but they would allow a physical, bioelectric connection between Grimskull's nervous system and the armor's mechanical control systems. Next came bone reinforcement. Grimskull's skeleton had to bear the crushing weight of the Terminator armor and transmit the force of his movements to its powerful servo systems. Skullcruncha used a massive, piston-driven syringe to inject a viscous mixture of metal fragments and fungal growth medium directly into Grimskull's largest bones. The procedure was agonizing, and Grimskull remained conscious throughout. Pain boys rarely used anesthesia, holding a core belief that pain strengthened the patient, burning away weakness. Grimskull's roars of agony were not of fear, but of endurance. The most critical and dangerous modification involved his spine. To control the armor's ravenous power systems, Grimskull needed enhanced conductivity throughout his central nervous system. Skullcruncha installed a series of polished metal rods along Grimskull's vertebrae, connecting them with thick copper wiring that would carry the bioelectric signals telling the armor how to move. The installation required cutting directly into Grimskull's spinal cord, a procedure that would have instantly paralyzed any human. By every known biological principle, the modification Skullcruncha performed should have been fatal. Nerve damage, septic shock, catastrophic blood loss. Any one of these factors should have killed Grimskull before the surgery was half complete. Yet he survived. His body, supercharged by the Wah field, adapted to each new violation with impossible speed. His belief that the surgery would succeed, combined with Skullcruncha's absolute confidence in his own grisly art, created a localized reality where medical science yielded to raw expectation. After 17 grueling hours, The surgery was finished. Grimskull rose from the operating table, his body a canvas of fresh scars and gleaming metal protrusions. He was fundamentally changed. He moved experimentally, testing the new connections, feeling the alien sensation of metal bonded to his very bones. Pain radiated from every nerve ending, but for an orc of his stature, pain was merely information. He walked to a workbench where a single, salvaged Terminator gauntlet lay inert. He placed his newly augmented hand over it. He touched it, and he felt something. The metal responded to his presence. A dead indicator light on the gauntlet flickered once, then glowed a steady green. A low hum vibrated through the metal, a system coming to life despite having no connected power source. It was reacting to his bioelectric field. The modifications worked. Now, all he needed was the armor. The command ship. Triumph of Faith had withdrawn to the cold safety of high orbit, a silent sentinel beyond the reach of the Orks, unpredictable teleportation. Aboard, the atmosphere was grim, military discipline barely containing the acrid frustration that pervaded every deck. Hundreds of Imperial soldiers, including dozens of irreplaceable Tempestus scions, lay dead on the rust-colored plains of Hexaplex Majoris. Their sacrifice had bought nothing. The Orks remained in control of critical facilities, and worse, they had revealed a cunning that challenged a millennium of Imperial doctrine. Inquisitor Helena Vance coordinated the analysis of the disastrous assault. Interrogations of captured Orks proved predictably useless. The Greenskins responded to questioning with either monosyllabic defiance, sudden violence, or inexplicable jokes that might have been profound threats or might have been utter nonsense. But the equipment recovered from the battlefield told a different story. Vance's tech specialists, their augmetic eyes blinking in disbelief, analyzed the crude modifications made to captured Imperial gear, and their findings were a litany of technological heresy. The modifications worked, not elegantly, not efficiently, but demonstrably, verifiably they functioned. Crude copper wiring that should have melted under the power load was instead conducting electricity between incompatible systems. Welds that should have compromised the structural integrity of ceramite plates had somehow strengthened them. Most impossibly, weapon systems that required a direct human neural interface were responding to the chaotic bioelectric signals of their Ork users, albeit with a stuttering, inconsistent fury. Vance presented her findings to the assembled commanders. Captain Varro, his pride still raw, stood beside the unmoving Iron Father Carden and a hololith of the furious Marshal Helbrecht. She laid out the evidence, culminating in her theory of the Wa field, a collective psychic effect that bent reality to the Ork's will. The reaction was exactly what she expected: dismissal, disbelief, and accusation. Crude but functional has always been the greenskin way, Captain Varro stated, his voice tight. They have always been able to make scrap work. This is a difference of scale, not of nature. Iron Father Carden offered a different, colder denial. They have stolen Mechanicum knowledge from the data vaults they captured. This is not Xenos innovation. It is blasphemous imitation. Helbrecht's hololithic ghost simply snarled, "It matters not how their trinkets work. We will crush them with overwhelming faith and firepower." The Black Templars argued for just that. A second, overwhelming assault to grind the Ork positions to dust, regardless of tactical complexity or cost. The Iron Hands demanded a methodical siege, a slow strangulation of resources that would allow for the careful recovery of all defiled technology. Varro and his Ultramarines advocated for a precise decapitation strike, targeting Grimskull himself. Each approach had merit, but none could succeed without a unity the fractured command structure could no longer provide. Vance countered with a different strategy. "We must understand the enemy before we attack again," she urged. I request authorization to capture a high-ranking specimen, a knob, or even one of their mech boys. Not for interrogation, but for live biological and psychic analysis. If we can determine how this field functions, we may find a weakness. The request was met with stony silence, then denied. The consensus deemed it excessive caution in the face of greenskin vermin. The deeper consequences of the initial failure began to manifest. Archmago Syntax 7 reported that the planetary defense network remained crippled, a catastrophe that was now impacting production quotas across the world. More alarmingly, long-range intercepts suggested that word of the battle was spreading. The Orks hadn't just fought effectively, they had fought intelligently. Other Ork tribes would hear of Grimskull's success. Other warbosses would begin to wonder. Ultimately, the commander settled on a flawed compromise. A coordinated assault would launch in 72 hours, combining elements of each chapter's preferred tactics, with half-formed contingencies for unexpected Ork responses. It was a plan born of ego and disagreement, a military operation designed by committee. As the others dispersed to prepare their forces, Inquisitor Vance returned to her data slates. For the next 3 days, she would study everything known about Grimskull the Magnificent, and the more she learned, the more certain she became that the Imperium was not preparing to fight a battle, but to confront a fundamental change in the nature of reality itself. The completed armor dominated Grocket's workshop, a blasphemous idol demanding worship. It stood over 3 meters tall, retaining the unmistakable brutalist silhouette of Adeptus Astartes Terminator plate. Yet it was horribly, fundamentally changed. The original ceramite surfaces had been crudely expanded with salvaged tank plating, creating a patchwork appearance that seemed both dangerously unstable and impossibly formidable. The sacred imperial gold trim was gone, replaced with dull, orcish bronze. On its chest, the defaced imperial aquila now bore a freshly painted skull and moon glyph, the symbol of Gork, or possibly Mork. The helmet was the most dramatic desecration. A Space Marine's helmet was a sealed, sophisticated system designed for human features. Grocket had solved the problem of the orcish skull by removing the faceplate entirely, replacing it with a heavy, open cage of wrought iron that provided protection while leaving Grimskull's massive, tusked jaw exposed to the air. The auto-senses, impossibly, remained functional, their data feeds crudely rerouted to small screens in Grimskull's peripheral vision, ready to be interpreted by his enhanced orcish sight. Grimskull approached his creation with a reverence that bordered on religious. This was the moment he had planned for, killed for, and physically transformed his body for. The armor represented more than power. It was destiny. It was proof that an Ork could not only defy humanity, but claim its greatest weapons and make them serve a greenskin's ambition. To fail now would be more than death. It would be a refutation of his entire existence, proof that Orks were, and always would be, the limited, brutish creatures their enemies believed them to be. The donning process was a horror of crude engineering. The armor didn't assemble around him with the quiet grace of a tech marine's ritual. Instead, it opened along jagged seams that Grocket had cut and hinged, allowing Grimskull to climb inside like a pilot entering a war machine. The metal interface plates, surgically embedded in his hide, scraped against crude receivers within the suit, establishing the physical connections that would translate his raw nerve impulses into servo-motor commands. With a final, deafening roar that shook the workshop walls, the power plant ignited, its output cranked far beyond its original specifications by Grocket's improvements. The first movements were a disaster. The armor was awkward, halting. A significant lag existed between Grimskull's intent and the suit's reaction, a disconnect that made every step a conscious, agonizing effort. The servos in the right leg locked, then surged, nearly throwing him off balance. The auto senses flooded his mind with a torrent of information formatted for a human brain, a chaotic stream of thermal, kinetic, and atmospheric data he struggled to comprehend. But it worked. Against every known principle of human technology, against every sacred tenet of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the armor functioned. Grimskull raised his right arm, and the armor's massive limb followed. He clenched his fist, and the integrated power claw crackled with a lethal halo of energy. He took one step, then another. And with each movement, he felt the ground shudder beneath his enhanced weight. In that moment, Grimskull's belief transformed into absolute certainty. The quiet whisper of doubt, the nagging fear that perhaps this was impossible after all, was utterly extinguished. In its place grew a conviction so powerful that the field surged around him like a physical thing, a visible shimmer in the air. Every orc in the workshop felt it. They felt the shift in reality as their collective expectation was met and exceeded. Their warboss had become something new, something more. The test continued as Grimskull pushed the armor's limits. With a roar of triumph, he reached up and tore a thick steel support beam from the ceiling with one hand, demonstrating a raw strength that now surpassed the original Terminator specifications. He activated the weapon integrated into his left arm, no longer a storm bolter, but a larger, multi-barreled contraption that spat a torrent of shells, reducing a target wall to a cloud of pulverized ferrocrete. With each passing minute, he moved faster, more fluidly, as his altered body and the armor's protesting systems learned to work together, bound by the sheer force of his will. Finally, he turned to his assembled warband, his voice booming through the armor's external voxcaster. "I am no longer Grimskull the Magnificent," he bellowed, the sound a fusion of orcish growl and electronic distortion. "I am Grimskull the Unstoppable, the first orc to wear a Yumi's best armor and make it proper orky." The wah began to spread, a psychic shockwave of belief rolling out from Hexaplex Majoris, destined to shake the galaxy. The weird boy Zogwart felt the change first. It began as a dull throb behind his eyes, a pressure that built until his skull felt like it might crack open. Weird boys were living conduits for the collective psychic energy of nearby greenskins. But this was different. This was not the usual background hum of orcish aggression. This was a symphony. As word of Grimskull's triumph spread like wildfire, the energy pouring into Zogwart grew from a river into a tidal wave. His eyes began to glow with a sickly green light, and the very air around him seemed to ripple and distort. A fundamental shift had occurred. Every orc in the warband now believed. It was not the casual, unthinking assumption of everyday orcish life, but a deep, fervent, absolute conviction that their warboss had achieved something legendary. This focused, unified belief was generating a psychic pressure unlike anything Zogwart had ever experienced, causing the field to swell to an unprecedented intensity. The effects were immediate. Across the complex, mech boys found their shoddy contraptions roaring to life. Knobs felt a surge of vitality, their bodies growing measurably larger and stronger. Even the lowliest grots seemed more cunning, elevated by their association with greatness. Grimskull himself understood these dynamics with a predator's instinct. He knew his power now depended on his warband's belief, and that to maintain it, he needed to provide constant, escalating proof. The armor was not just a weapon, it was a symbol, a declaration that the old limits no longer applied. This understanding drove his next decision. He found Grocket and gave a simple, terrifying order. Begin converting additional suits of armor for his most loyal knobs. Not Terminator armor, that would diminish the unique glory of his own suit, but the dozens of standard power armor suits they had salvaged. If one orc in human armor was impressive, a dozen would be unstoppable. An army of greenskins clad in ceramite could conquer the galaxy. The Imperium's greatest nightmare was already unfolding. Garbled orc vox transmissions carried the story of Grimskull's achievement beyond Hexaplex Majoris. Other tribes throughout the sector heard the legend. Some dismissed it as lies. Others, intrigued, sent spies to witness the truth. And a few, the most ambitious warbosses, began their own crude attempts to replicate the success. The armor had made Grimskull more than a warboss. It had made him a prophet, a symbol around which the disparate, warring tribes of the greenskin race might finally unite. Back in the stronghold, the psychic torrent became too much for Zogwart. He collapsed, his body convulsing as the concentrated wah field briefly connected him to the collective orcish consciousness. He saw a vision. He saw not thousands, but millions of orcs across the galaxy, their attention drawn to the psychic beacon of Hexaplex Majoris, their ambitions aligning with Grimskull's. He saw the future this moment might create. Not just a successful raid, but the first tremor of an avalanche that could shake the Imperium to its foundations. When the vision faded, Zogwart lay panting on the floor, his nose bleeding green ichor. He said nothing. Some knowledge was simply too big for words, even for orky ones. The Weir was coming. While the Imperial war machine ground its gears in preparation for another assault, Inquisitor Vance worked. For 72 hours, she barely slept, pushing beyond the limits of conventional intelligence gathering. Her methods bordered on the heretical. She consulted with sanctioned psychers, their minds brushing against the psychic stain of the greenskin horde. She cross-referenced classified mechanicum files on orc biology with forbidden texts on the galaxy's ancient history. She even had her acolytes bring her recovered orc artifacts, crude chunks of metal and bone, which she examined with esoteric scanners, searching for something beyond their physical properties. Her findings earned her a private audience. In a shielded briefing room aboard the Triumph of Faith, she faced the commanders, who were finally desperate enough to listen. Captain Varro was there, his pride still raw from the ambush, his face a mask of grim determination. Iron Father Carden of the Iron Hands attended, his logical mind unable to ignore the mountain, impossible evidence. And via shimmering hololith, the ancient Archmagos Syntex 7 observed, her mechanical form radiating cold fury. Vance began not with theory, but with facts. She projected recordings of captured orc technology, a bolter that fired despite a blocked barrel, a power pack that generated energy without a fuel source. Then she moved to the biological data, showing how orc physiology healed and adapted to trauma at rates that defied all known science. "We have been fighting the orcs for 10,000 years, she stated, her voice calm but heavy with implication. And we have never truly understood what they are. We see a mindless, savage horde. We are wrong. They are not a naturally evolved species that simply adapted to warfare. They are war itself, given biological form." She let that sink in before delivering the core of her discovery. They were created, engineered by a civilization from the dawn of time as the perfect weapon. Their biology, their crude technology, their very psychology, it is all designed for one purpose: to create an ever-improving, ever-escalating threat. The more they fight, the more they believe they can win. And the more they believe they can win, the more capable the universe allows them to be. Vance gestured to a new projection, a swirling vortex of green energy. The Wah field. It is not a random psychic phenomenon. It is their primary evolutionary engine. It responds to their collective conviction, subtly altering reality to match what they believe is possible. And Grimskull, she said, her voice dropping, has just given them a new, terrifying possibility to believe in. She explained that by successfully wearing Space Marine Terminator armor, Grimskull had provided a proof of concept. He had proven to his entire species that the most sacred, most complex technology of their greatest enemy could be claimed. This proof, this idea, would now spread like a virus through the collective Ork consciousness. If this is not contained, Vance continued, within decades, Orks across the galaxy will begin attempting similar modifications. Most will fail, but some will succeed. And every success will make the next one more likely. Soon, Warbosses in power armor will be a common sight. After that, perhaps they will claim our Titans, our starships, the archaeotech weapons that even the Mechanicum no longer understands how to build. The room was silent. Vance painted the terrifying endpoint. An Ork species that could loot any technology it encountered, limited only by its violent imagination. A galaxy where humanity's technological superiority, the one advantage that had kept the Imperium from collapsing, means nothing, because the Orks can simply take it. It was Varro who finally spoke, his voice hoarse. If you are right, Inquisitor, how do we stop it? Vance's gaze was unflinching. Grimskull must not merely be killed. His armor must be utterly destroyed, atomized, leaving no trace that could inspire another. His warband must be annihilated to the last Ork, before the story of his success can spread any further. Every record of this engagement must be suppressed. We must erase this achievement from history, from both Imperial archives and Ork memory. She looked at each of them in turn, the full weight of her conclusion settling upon them. The assault you are about to launch is not a military operation. It is an act of reality modification. We are attempting to make Grimskull's success never have happened by eliminating every shred of evidence that it did. Because if we fail, this is the beginning of the end for humanity's dominion over technology. No pressure. The second assault began not with a charge, but with a judgment from the heavens. In high orbit, Imperial cruisers aligned their lances, and pillars of incandescent light struck Hexaplex Majoris's third moon. The Ork teleporta platforms, the source of the Imperium's previous humiliation, were not merely destroyed. They were vaporized, their component atoms scattered across the lunar dust. Only then did the ground attack commence. This time, there was no arrogance, no assumption of a simple green-skin horde. Drop pods and landing craft deployed in disciplined waves, establishing overlapping fields of fire and redundant communication nets. Every squad was a hard point, every company a fortress. Captain Varro led his ultramarines through the skeletal remains of a hab-block district. The memory of the ambush burned in his twin hearts, fueling a cold, precise fury. His marines moved not in a single spearhead, but as a web of smaller, interlocking units. They advanced slowly, methodically, every shadow treated as a potential ambush site, every Auspex scanner sweeping for threats. The advance was a grinding, deliberate process, the very opposite of the glorious charges depicted in chapter frescoes. It was the ugly, necessary work of fighting an enemy who had proven he could think. The Orks responded with predictable ferocity, but their defense felt different. They fought from prepared positions, their fire coordinated, but they gave ground too easily. For every fortified manufactorum the Ultramarines took, another lay just ahead, its defenders just as stubborn, but just as willing to fall back. Varro felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. They were advancing, they were winning territory, but they were not encountering the core of Grimskull's warband. This was a rearguard, a distraction. They were attacking a ghost. The truth revealed itself at the mouth of a colossal smelting pit. As Varro's squad rounded a rusted promethium tank, they came face to face with it. An ork, but not just any ork. It was a brute, a knob of immense size, and it was wearing the scavenged, horribly modified shell of Mark 7 Aquila power armor. The chest plate had been crudely hammered out to fit its barrel-like torso, the Imperial Aquila defaced with a leering red skull. Wires snaked from its back to power a chugging, oversized choppa. The sight froze Vero for a full second. It wasn't just Grimskull. The infection had spread. The duel was a clash of philosophies. Varro was a master swordsman, his movements a blur of cerulean plate and disciplined grace. The knob was a walking avalanche, its stolen armor groaning as servos were pushed far beyond their designated tolerances, trading all precision for terrifying, raw strength. Varro's power sword darted in, finding gaps in the crude ork modifications. But for every cut he landed, the knob's massive weapon slammed into his defenses, the impacts jarring his bones. The fight ended when Varro ducked under a wild swing and drove his blade through the knob's unhelmed face. But as the greenskin fell, its final, flailing blow had crushed the servo mechanisms in Varro's left leg, leaving him hobbled. And then the Vox net erupted in a chorus of disbelief and panic. From the Black Templar's front, "Contact! Multiple armored greenskins, Sector Epsilon!" From the Iron Hands, "We have engaged a trio of Orks in Astartes plate, requesting fire support." Across the entire battlefield, the same nightmare was unfolding. Grimskull's achievement was no longer unique. It was a prototype. The Imperial advance shuddered to a halt. The entire strategy had been predicated on a single high-value target. Now, there were dozens. The surgical strike had become a chaotic brawl against an enemy that was evolving in real time. Varro, leaning against the corpse of his foe, received the new orders with grim acceptance. Hold position, consolidate gains, await reinforcement. The assault was over. The siege had begun. Miles away from the observation deck of a new, better fortified stronghold, Grimskull watched the Imperial battle line dig in. He saw their momentum bleed away into caution. He saw his own forces, bloodied but unbroken, coalescing around their new armored leaders. He smiled, a terrifying crescent of tusks in the gloom of his Terminator helmet. Every day the Yumis waited was another day for Grokhit to work his magic. Every day was another day for the stories to spread. Time was a weapon, and Grimskull had just seized it. In the thick of the siege, as plasma fire turned ferrocrete to slag, Grimskull discovered his new skin had a will of its own. The armor's movements would occasionally stutter, a half-second of hesitation that almost cost him his head as a Lehman Russ battle cannon shell screamed past. The targeting reticle in his vision flickered, displaying enemy heat signatures that weren't there and ignoring others that were. Power distribution to the integrated claw would fluctuate without reason, its energy field sputtering at the very moment of impact. The Wah field, that great green engine of belief, forced the armor to function through sheer collective will, but it was like wrestling with a stubborn beast. The suit worked, but it fought him every step of the way. He didn't think in terms of machine spirits or techno-heresy. That was Yumi nonsense. To Grimskull, it was simple. There was a git in the machine, an angry ghost that didn't like its new owner. His solution, as always, was direct. He would find this ghost, and he would break it. Back in the command sanctum, a repurposed engine block manufactorum, he had Grokhit run his diagnostics. The mech boy, his face a mask of intense concentration, tapped at the armor's chest plate with a massive spanner, listening to the resonance. His analysis was blunt. The armor's brain box, its central cogitator, was still full of the Yumi who wore it last. It wasn't a real ghost, not like a weird boy saw. It was more like an echo, a set of habits and hatreds burned into the circuitry. It recognized Grimskull as a Xenos, a desecration, and its programming, its very soul, was trying to reject the graft. The philosophical implications were irrelevant. This was a practical problem. Grimskull summoned Weird Boy Zogwart. The plan was simple. Zogwart would go into the machine with his mind and tell the Yumi Git who was boss now. The Weird Boy, his eyes already swirling with green energy, approached the inert Terminator suit. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with psychic potential. Zogwart placed his hands on the armor's helmet, closed his eyes, and plunged his consciousness inward. He found not a mind, but a fortress. A cold, rigid structure of pure data, imbued with the emotional residue of its former master. Zogwart felt the psychic imprint of a warrior who had served for 3 centuries, absolute duty, unbending honor, and a searing, bottomless hatred for all things not human. Every time Grimskull tried to move an arm, this echo of duty tried to lock it in place. Every time he tried to fire a weapon, this echo of hatred tried to turn it on the Ork himself. It was a psychic battle against a program, faith against code. Zogwart didn't fight it with logic. He fought it with the "Wah!" He opened himself up to the collective, howling belief of every Ork on Hexaplex Majoris. He took their certainty, their love of violence, their absolute conviction that bigger is better and that might makes right, and he unleashed it like a tidal wave against the Yumi's fortress of rules. The armor doesn't belong to a dead Umi. It belongs to the boss. It doesn't serve some corpse god. It serves the Wa. The psychic backlash was immense. Zogwart screamed, and thick, green ichor poured from his nose and ears. For hours, the battle raged in a dimension of pure thought. Finally, with a psychic snap that echoed through the manufactorum, the Yumi's fortress of logic shattered. Zogwart collapsed, spent and bleeding, but alive. When Grimskull climbed back into the armor, the difference was immediate. The hesitations were gone. The systems responded with smooth, brutal efficiency. The machine spirit hadn't been destroyed. It had been converted. It had been convinced, through overwhelming psychic force, that Grimskull was its rightful master. A disturbing thought surfaced in Grimskull's mind. If belief could turn an enemy's armor, what else could it turn? He flexed his power claw, the energy field humming with a steady, murderous thrum. He raised his weapon, the targeting systems locking onto a distant, ruined spire with perfect clarity. The armor was no longer a tool he wrestled with. It was an extension of his will. Grimskull smiled. The Yumis had not seen anything yet. 2 weeks, 14 days of grinding, relentless, soul-crushing warfare had transformed Hexaplex Majoris into a charnel house. The initial, clean lines of the Imperial assault had devolved into a sprawling, festering wound of a front line that bled men and machines into the rust-colored dust. The Orks had turned an entire industrial district into a fortress of scrap and malice. Every manufactorum was a strong point, every transport corridor a meticulously prepared killing field. The Imperial estimate for the campaign's duration had shifted from weeks to months to the grim, bureaucratic designation. Duration uncertain. For the Imperial Guard, it was a meat grinder. Regiments were fed into the line and withdrawn. Days later, shattered and decimated, their survivors hollow-eyed. The Space Marines conducted their surgical strikes, but the Orks had learned. Grimskull's knobs and key mech boys were kept deep within the warren, protected by layers upon layers of expendable grots and boys. Even the god machines of the Titan legions were struggling, their colossal frames too cumbersome for the tight, multi-level canyons of the hab blocks, where Ork tank-bust us with suicidal courage would leap from gantries to plant crack bombs on their adamantium knees. On the other side of the line, desperation was just as keen, but it tasted different. It tasted like opportunity. Grimskull's original warband of 50,000 had been whittled down to less than 20,000 combat-capable orcs. But this was an acceptable loss, because in the slime-choked undercrofts and corpse-strewn sump drains, a new generation was already sprouting. The spores of the fallen were gestating, growing into fresh warriors. The Imperium was fighting an enemy that replenished its ranks from its own dead. Both sides were starving. Imperial supply lines were harassed by Ork vessels that had slipped the blockade, while the greenskins, lacking any real logistical tail, were running low on everything. Ammunition was a currency traded for food, and medical supplies were a fantasy. Inquisitor Vance needed better intelligence. She attached herself to a squad of Tempestus Scions on a deep reconnaissance mission, their objective to pinpoint Grimskull's current command post. Cloaked by the constant smog and the din of battle, they slipped through the lines, moving like ghosts through the skeletal ruins. They were deep in Ork territory when they saw it, a routine patrol. 5 orcs, but 2 of them were different. They moved with the heavy, piston-driven gait of power armor. The engagement was sudden and horrific. The Scions opened fire with their hot-shot laser-guns, bolts of incandescent energy stitching across the orcs' crude armor. 3 of the unarmored orcs went down in a spray of green blood. The other 2 weathered the storm. These suits were not the clumsy prototypes seen in the first days of the siege. They were streamlined, the salvaged plates integrated with a brutal but effective artistry. The orcs inside moved with a new confidence, a fluidity that spoke of hours of practice. Grocket was learning. The Wa field was amplifying his every success. One of the armored orcs charged, its crude chain axe roaring, and tore a scion in half. The other laid down suppressing fire from a bolter that had been crudely welded to its forearm. Vance and the surviving scions extracted under fire, dragging their wounded, leaving 3 of their own behind. Vance's report to the Imperial Command Council was a splash of ice water in a room already frigid with failure. Her intelligence, confirmed by drone Picts, was undeniable. The orcs now fielded approximately 40 warriors in modified power armor, and production was ongoing. The siege, designed to starve and contain the threat, was instead acting as an incubator, giving Grimskull's mech boys the time and battlefield salvage they needed to perfect their blasphemous craft. The commanders were torn. Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars demanded they unleash the Titans on Grimskull's fortress. Collateral damage and civilian casualties be damned. The Iron Hands argued for a patient, methodical siege, tightening the noose until the orcs exhausted themselves. Vance, her face grim, advocated for a decapitation strike. Forget the army, forget the territory. A surgical operation to kill Grimskull, whose will and vision were the engine of this entire nightmare. They could not agree. And so, the siege continued. The artillery roared, the las fire crackled, and the body count climbed. And with every passing day, in the smoky heart of the Ork Warren, another suit of desecrated armor was fitted to another hulking green form. The Imperium was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that grew stronger the longer they fought it. Grimskull stood on the needlepoint of a shattered spire, the highest peak in his conquered kingdom of rust and ruin. Below him, Hexaplex Majoris burned. The flickering lines of the siege were a glorious, chaotic tapestry of destruction. He wore the Terminator armor not as a tool, but as a second skin. He had not taken it off in days. It had ceased to be a machine he piloted. It had become a part of his body, an extension of his will, a constant humming reminder to every orc who saw him that the universe had new rules. Most warbosses would have looked at the battlefield and seen only the next fight. the next skull to take. But Grimskull was different. As he watched the grinding, attritional warfare below, he saw not a path to victory, but a path to extinction. The Yumis had too many men, too many ships, too much of everything. Even if he crushed every last soldier on this world, more would come. The Imperium's greatest weapon wasn't their guns or their ships, it was their endless, grinding patience. They could afford to lose battles. Grimskull could not. He wasn't trying to win this war. He was trying to change how all wars were fought. He understood, in a way no Ork before him ever had, the fundamental weakness of his species. Orks were the greatest warriors in the galaxy, but their genius was ephemeral. A brilliant mech boy would invent a new kind of custom mega blasta, die in a glorious explosion, and his knowledge would die with him. A cunning warboss would master a new tactic, get his head caved in by a rival, and the next boss would have to learn it all over again. Orks didn't progress. They repeated. Grimskull intended to break that cycle. His armor was the key. It wasn't just power, it was memory. It was proof, forged in ceramite and steel, that an Ork could claim the most advanced technology in the galaxy. It was knowledge that could be passed down. He had already set Grocket to the task, not just of building, but of teaching. Younger, brighter mech boys were being trained as apprentices, learning the sacred art of hitting tech with a hammer until it worked proper. He had them scratching notes onto metal plates, crude, barely legible schematics and glyphs that documented every success, every failure. He was building something the Orks had never had before, an institution, a legacy. In his mind's eye, he saw the future. In 100 years, every self-respecting warboss would lead a retinue of armored knobs. In 500, Ork mech boys wouldn't just be looting armor, they'd be building their own, having stolen and perfected the principles the Mechanicum guarded as holy writ. In a millennium, the technological gap that kept humanity alive would be gone. There would be Ork titans, Ork starships, and Ork Wah that could drown the galaxy not just in bodies, but in firepower. He discussed it with Grocket, who had come to deliver a report. The mech boy didn't understand the long-term vision, the talk of generations and legacies. It wasn't how an Ork's mind worked, but he understood the practical instruction. Build stuff that lasts, Grimskull had grunted, and teach the other gits how to build it, so they don't have to start from scratch when you get crumped. Make the knowledge bigger than just one Ork. Grocket had nodded, his mind alight not with philosophy, but with the simple, brilliant, un-Orkai idea of not having to reinvent the wheel every time. Later, Grimskull gathered his surviving knobs. He told them the truth. They would not win this siege by fighting harder. They would win by surviving. Their job was to hold out long enough for their legend to become a contagion. And it was already working. Weird boys brought him visions, and Blood Axe spies brought him reports. Ork fleets were on the move all across the sector. Warbosses, drawn by the psychic echo of Grimskull's triumph, were converging on Hexaplex Majoris. They wanted to see the armor for themselves. They wanted to learn his secrets. The siege was no longer a trap. It was a beacon. The Wah was no longer about one warband on one world. It was about what Orks would become, now that they knew anything was possible. The council chamber aboard the Triumph of Faith was a tomb sealed in orbit. Hololithic displays shimmered in the gloom, projecting casualty reports that were an affront to the assembled demigods of war. The numbers scrolled upward with sickening regularity. Over 2,000 Imperial soldiers lost in 3 weeks of grinding siege. 47 of them were Space Marines, the genetic sons of Primarchs, each one an investment of decades, an irreplaceable repository of chapter lore and martial excellence. And for every 100 Orks they killed, 1,000 more seemed to sprout from the blood-soaked soil of Hexaplex Majoris. The attrition models were clear. The Imperium was losing. Captain Varro of the Ultramarines spoke first, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. His argument was doctrine, pure and simple, the cornerstone of Astartes warfare for 10 millennia. We must sever the head of the beast. All our efforts must be bent toward a single purpose, the death of the war boss Grimskull. He gestured to a tactical display showing the Ork stronghold, a fortress of scrap and stolen industry. Without him, the warband will devour itself. Their organization will collapse. The armoring project will cease. The threat will be contained. The logic was sound, but the challenge remained unspoken. How to reach a leader buried under 20,000 greenskins and a mountain of fortified metal. Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars slammed a gauntleted fist on the council table, the impact ringing like a death knell. Patience is a virtue for saints, not soldiers. We have 30 Terminator suits aboard this vessel, and another 20 between our allies. We will teleport them all into the heart of the Ork filth, and let them carve a path of righteousness to this war boss. We will burn them out, root and stem, and accept the cost. It was the Black Templar way, a furious, righteous charge, accepting catastrophic losses as a worthy price for exterminating the foe. The cost is unacceptable. The voice was as cold and hard as polished steel. Iron Father Carden of the Iron Hands stared at Helbrecht, his bionic eyes devoid of emotion. Your strategy risks the one thing we cannot afford to lose, our most sacred technology. Should your glorious charge fail, should even one of those Terminator suits fall into their hands, we will have armed them with the very prize they seek. We will have fed the beast, not slain it. The logic is flawed. Into the tense silence stepped Inquisitor Vance. She activated her own data slate, projecting evidence that made the Mechanicum representative on the hololith flicker with binary agitation. Commanders, you continue to treat this as a conventional foe. It is not. Their technology, their very resilience, is powered by a collective psychic field. A field. She paused, letting the heresy of her words sink in. We cannot defeat the field with bolt rounds, but we can disrupt it. She proposed the unthinkable, the deployment of assassins from the Culexus Temple, psychic blanks, whose very presence is anathema to the warp and its energies. A small team, deployed alongside a primary strike force. If they can get close to Grimskull, their null aura will suppress the field around him. His armor, which functions only by the power of that belief, will fail. He will be rendered mortal. The chamber erupted. Helbrecht decried the use of such soulless abominations. Carden questioned the reliability of such an unproven esoteric tactic. Even Varro seemed unnerved by the prospect of fighting alongside beings whose nature was a void in reality. The coalition that had been forged in necessity was fracturing under the pressure of failure, old rivalries, and doctrinal dogmas rising to the surface. Ultimately, with no single strategy winning consensus, they settled on a desperate compromise. A plan born of a committee, riddled with risk. A massed diversionary attack would be launched along the entire siege line, drawing the bulk of the Ork defenders. Simultaneously, a Terminator strike force, smaller than Helbrecht wanted, larger than Carden advised, would teleport into the stronghold. And with them, under Vance's direct authority, would go the Culexus assassins. The operation would launch in 48 hours. The commanders dispersed, the air thick with unspoken doubt. It was a plan that attempted to be everything at once, a decapitation strike, a brute force assault, and an unconventional gambit. It was a plan that could win the war or lose the galaxy. Captain Varro spent the night before the assault in the chapel of the Triumph of Faith. It was a space of stark, martial piety, its walls inscribed with the names of ultramarines who had fallen in service to the Emperor across 10,000 years of war. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He stood before the gilded Aquila, his helmet off, the recycled air cool on his scarred face, and he reflected. This was his ritual, the quiet accounting a commander owes his men. 47 names had been added to the litany of the lost since their arrival at Hexaplex Majoris. He saw each face in his mind's eye, recalled the specific excellence of each warrior, and felt the weight of their absence, not as grief, but as a debt. Tomorrow, that debt would be paid, and in the paying of it, more names would be added to the chapel walls. His duty was to accept this terrible arithmetic. Acceptance, he knew, was not the same as indifference. Miles below, on the poisoned surface of the Forge world, Grimskull conducted a ritual of his own. He was not reflecting on the past, for orcs only care about the now and the next. He was maintaining his armor. In the flickering light of the workshop, surrounded by the scent of hot metal and ozone, he meticulously checked the crude linkages and reinforced power conduits Grawkit had shown him. Each bolt tightened, each plate polished with an oily rag, was an act of reinforcing his own existence. The armor was no longer a tool. It was his skin, the physical manifestation of his ambition. It had become part of him, and he cared for it with a strange, possessive focus that other orcs would find baffling. He carried the weight of his entire way, the belief of every greenskin under his command. He felt it not as a burden, but as fuel. In her Spartan quarters aboard the command ship, Inquisitor Helena Vance was also preparing. Her vigil was one of information, not faith or steel. Data slates and hololithic projections filled the room, a swirling galaxy of intelligence reports, probability matrices, and contingency plans. She was not a general. Her expertise was in the precise application of knowledge, the surgical removal of a single critical threat. Tomorrow, she would be responsible for deploying soulless assassins into the maelstrom of a planetary assault, a chaotic variable in an equation with too many unknowns. A quiet, cold fear gnawed at her, not the fear of dying, a risk she had accepted the day she took her vows. It was the fear of being wrong. If her theories about the way field were flawed, if her Calexis assets failed to perform as expected, she would have squandered irreplaceable assets, and her failure would be measured in the continued rise of an existential threat. The weight of being the only one who might be right, and the terror of being disastrously wrong, was a heavier burden than any armor. And across the front, the lesser souls prepared in their own ways. Akkadian sergeant, his face young but his eyes ancient, scribbled a last letter to a family on a world he hadn't seen in a decade, knowing the message might take years to arrive, if it ever did. In a squalid orc pit, a young boy, not yet a knob, sharpened the pitted edge of his choppa, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal a prayer to Gork, or possibly Mork. He felt no fear, only a savage, simple joy at the prospect of the coming fight. The false dawn of Hexaplex Majoris began to stain the polluted sky. The night of quiet moments was over. In orbit, Terminators were armed and blessed. On the ground, engines of war roared to life. Grimskull locked his helmet into place, the world turning a bloody, data-rich red. Both sides believed they would be victorious. Both accepted that belief was not enough. The battle was about to begin. The heavens over Hexaplex Majoris tore open. Imperial strike cruisers, knives in the dark, descended from high orbit to unleash a torrent of divine fury. Bombardment cannons hammered Ork positions, each earth-shattering impact a prayer to the God Emperor. The polluted sky lit up with a storm of weapons, fire as crude Ork anti-aircraft guns spat defiance at the descending apocalypse. Landing craft burned and tumbled from the sky, their occupants dying without ever setting foot on the ground. But for every one lost, 10 more broke through the flak, carrying vengeance to the surface. Aboard the Triumph of Faith, the air in the teleportarium crackled with ozone. 30 giants clad in tactical dreadnought armor stood motionless as the final rites were administered. Teleportation was a violation, a sensation of being unmade and remade that even an Astartes never grew accustomed to. One moment, the sterile, sanctified air of the strike cruiser. The next, the coppery stench of greenskin and the roar of a world at war. Reality fractured across the Ork stronghold. Flares of impossible light heralded the arrival of the Terminators. They appeared not at the battlements, but deep within the enemy's heart, in command posts, in ammunition dumps, in the very workshops where the Greenskins' technological heresy was born. The shock of their arrival was absolute. Storm bolters roared in the confines of scrap metal corridors, their mass-reactive shells turning Ork and barricade into a single, bloody expression of ruin. Power fists crushed, chain fists whirred, and the disciplined wrath of the Adeptus Astartes was unleashed. The greenskin response, for the first time in weeks, was pure chaos. Orks who had been preparing for a frontal assault found demigods of destruction in their midst, behind their lines, everywhere at once. The command structure Grimskull had so carefully imposed began to fray as knobs responded to the immediate, overwhelming threat rather than strategic orders. Squad Primus of the Imperial Fists materialized inside a massive Ork barracks. Their storm bolters cleared the chamber in seconds, a disciplined storm of explosive death that left nothing standing. But as their sergeant advanced through the carnage, he noted the defensive placements, the organized fallback positions. These were not the mindless beasts of doctrine. They were soldiers. The true shock came when another squad teleported directly before Grocket's workshop. They were met not by terrified grots, but by armored knobs, their hulking forms encased in crude, sparking mockeries of power armor. The clash was a nightmare of screaming metal and incandescent energy. The knobs were slower, clumsier, but impossibly strong. 2 Terminators fell, their sacred armor breached by overcharged power claws, a cost that was supposed to be impossible. The knobs were eventually annihilated, but they had proven their point. The wah had made the armor work better than anyone had dreamed. Simultaneously, the main siege lines erupted. Imperial Guard regiments surged forward under a rolling artillery barrage. Titans, their war horns bellowing, crushed fortifications under their adamantium feet. The full, coordinated might of the Imperium was a force of nature, an irresistible tide of steel and faith. And yet, the Orks did not break. Though their positions were overrun and their casualties were catastrophic, a core of furious resistance held firm, anchored by the sheer, indomitable will of their war boss. In the swirling maelstrom of the assault, as Imperial forces pushed deeper into his territory, Inquisitor Vance gave the final order. 3 shadows detached from the Imperial lines, moving with an unnatural silence that even the din of battle could not conceal. Their presence was a void, a null field of psychic emptiness. The Culexis assassins were in play. The race to reach Grimskull had begun. Captain Vero's company stormed through the breach, the air thick with the stench of ozone and hot metal. They found themselves in a vast assembly hall, a desecrated temple of industry that now served as Grimskull's throne room. And there, at its heart, surrounded by a court of his most brutish knobs, stood the war boss. He was a monument to blasphemy. The Terminator armor had been altered again. More plates, thicker and more jagged, had been welded to its frame. The storm bolter on its arm was gone, replaced by a monstrous cannon scavenged from a battle tank, its barrel wide enough to swallow a man's head. But it was Grimskull himself that froze Varro's blood. He was bigger, somehow. Taller and broader than any orc the captain had ever seen, his sheer physical presence straining the seams of the expanded armor. His eyes burned with a cold, calculating intelligence that was utterly alien to his kind. There was no challenge, no boast. There was only the disciplined fury of the Ultramarines. Bolt rounds, plasma bolts, and melta beams converged on the war boss in a single, coordinated volley of annihilation. The armor held. Impacts that would have vaporized a lesser target merely scarred its surface, the ceramite glowing cherry red before cooling. Grimskull didn't even flinch. He raised his new cannon, and it answered the Imperial fire with a deafening roar. An ultramarine vanished in a flash of incandescent energy. The battle was joined. Varro's company encircled their target, a ring of blue and gold against a titan of green and rust. Power swords met the swinging power claw. Chainswords screamed against plates of stolen adamantium. But Grimskull was not just a brute. He fought with a horrifying tactical awareness, using his bulk to shield his flanks, pivoting to meet multiple attackers, his every move calculated to inflict maximum carnage. This was not a brawl. It was a duel against a master of violence, and all around him, the Wech was a living thing. The very air seemed to press down on the Astartes, thick with the psychic static of greenskin belief. Weapons jammed, Auspex scanners filled with ghost signals, Ork reinforcements boiled out of corridors that had been cleared moments before, their movements unnervingly coordinated. Grimskull was not just a warrior in a suit. He was the epicenter of a reality-warping storm. Then, the storm broke. At the edges of the Great Hall, 3 voids opened in the psychic tempest. 3 skeletal figures in black sin-skin suits flickered into existence, their presence a deadening null field that drank the energy from the air. The oppressive atmosphere vanished. The Ork reinforcements faltered, suddenly disorganized and confused. Imperial weapons began to function with the cold, lethal perfection of their design. Grimskull felt it as a physical blow. The warm, roaring certainty of the Wech was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow silence. His armor, a moment ago an extension of his will, suddenly felt like a leaden cage. The machine spirit, the ghost of the Umi warrior long suppressed, fought back with renewed vigor. A servo in his leg hesitated, his cannon's targeting reticle flickered and died. He was weakened. But Grimskull the Magnificent had clawed his way to the top of the Orkish hierarchy through sheer, bloody-minded violence long before he wore this metal shell. The assassins had not just weakened him, they had enraged him. With a bellow of pure, primal fury that shook the hall, he ignored the Space Marines hacking at his armor. He charged the source of the cold, the source of the doubt. His power claw, crackling with overcharged energy, rose high. The nearest Culexus, a being bred to be an unkillable predator, tried to evade. It was too slow. The claw smashed down, and the psychic void collapsed as its source was annihilated in a wet crunch of bone and synth flesh. 2 assassins remained, and Grimskull had stopped being cautious. With 2 psychic voids still polluting the hall, the field around Grimskull remained a tattered, flickering thing. His armor, once an extension of his will, was now a rebellious cage. A system would lag, a servo would hesitate, and in that flicker of imperfection, Captain Varro saw his opening. This was the moment. He committed everything to it. Varro charged, his power sword, the Blade of Valor, a relic that had tasted heretic blood at the scouring, blazed with azure light. He didn't aim for the chest or the head, eschewing brute force for surgical precision. The blade found the crude, unhallowed seam where Grocket had joined the Terminator helmet cage to the shoulder pauldron. It was a gap, a flaw. The sword bit deep, and for the first time since the siege began, green ichor sprayed from the Warboss's flesh. Grimskull's response was not a roar of pain, but of pure, instinctual fury. His power claw, moving with a speed that defied its bulk, swept low. Vero tried to pivot, but the blow was too fast, too wide. It caught his leg, and the world became a blur of spinning metal and screaming pain. The captain's Mark 7 armor absorbed an impact that would have atomized an unaugmented man, but red runes flashed across his cracked helmet display. Structural integrity compromised. Power conduits severed. His leg was a ruin of shattered bone and mangled muscle. The duel devolved into a brutal exchange of opposites. Vero, fighting on one good leg, became a whirlwind of disciplined swordsmanship. He was the product of 2 centuries of training. His blade a blur that sought out every chink, every weld, every weak point in Grimskull's blasphemous armor. Each strike drew more green blood, each wound a testament to Astartes' skill. But Grimskull was a force of nature. He was stronger, his reach was longer, and he fought with the desperate certainty that to lose now was to lose everything. His massive fist, sheathed in ceramite, battered Vero's helmet again and again, the displays shattering, the world outside becoming a fractured mosaic. The power claw tore entire plates from the captain's armor, exposing the black carapace beneath. Inside his failing body, Voro was a cold flame of purpose. Pain was just data. Blood loss was a tactical problem. His thoughts were not of survival, but of duty. He saw the faces of the 47 brothers lost on this world. He felt the weight of his chapter's honor. This creature could not be allowed to endure. What he represented was a poison that could kill the Imperium. Grimskull, for the first time in his life, felt the cold touch of doubt. The Wah was thin and distant. The armor was fighting him, the Yumi ghost inside it screaming defiance. His wounds, which his orky physiology should have ignored, hurt. The pain was a distraction, a weakness he had never known. This little blue Umi just kept getting up, his sword a persistent, stinging insect that refused to be crushed. The absolute conviction that had carried him to this throne room began to waver, and in its place, an alien feeling crept in. Fear. The end came with the silent step of the second Calexis. The assassin closed to within meters of the dueling titans, and the null field around them intensified into a soul-crushing deadness. For Grimskull, it was the final betrayal. The Wah field didn't just weaken, it vanished. His armor's systems, overwhelmed by the machine spirit's sudden, unrestrained revolt, locked solid. The power claw froze mid-swing. The legs seized. He was a statue, a 3-meter monument of green flesh and stolen steel, utterly immobile. Vero saw it. Through a haze of blood and agony, he saw his enemy frozen in time. He did not hesitate. Pushing off his ruined leg, he drove himself upward with the last of his strength. The blade of valor found the gap beneath Grimskull's chin, a space left for his massive jaw to jut forward. The relic sword slid through flesh and bone, punching through the back of the orc's thick skull and into the brain beyond. There was no final cry, no death rattle. Grimskull the Magnificent, the prophet of a new age for his species, died standing upright, his eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending surprise. He had not expected to die. Not now. Not like this. The battle still raged around them, but its heart had stopped beating. As his enemy stood lifeless, held erect by the very armor that had been his triumph and his doom, Captain Titus Vero of the Ultramarines finally collapsed, his own body broken, his duty done. The death of the war boss was a psychic cataclysm. The unifying pressure of the war, the singular will that had held 50,000 greenskins in a state of unprecedented coordination, simply vanished. In its place was a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the true, primordial nature of the Ork. Knobs, who had served Grimskull loyally moments before, now saw only rivals for the empty throne. A brutal, internecine war for succession erupted in the heart of the Imperial assault. Weapons that had been aimed at space marines were turned on former allies. The disciplined defense of Hexaplex Majoris dissolved into a riot of bloody ambition. The Imperium, sensing the shift, exploited it with merciless efficiency. Terminator squads, no longer facing coordinated resistance, advanced with terrifying speed, their stormbolters methodically executing Ork leaders before they could establish any new authority. The main Imperial assault, which had been grinding against a wall of green flesh, suddenly broke through crumbling defensive lines. Within hours, the organized Ork threat on the planet was over, replaced by the much more manageable chaos of scattered, warring mobs. Captain Vero was alive, but only just. Apothecaries swarmed his broken form, their narthequiums whirring as they administered emergency stimulants and coagulants. They extracted him from the battlefield, his victory absolute, but his body a ruin. The diagnosis was grim. Recovery would take months, possibly years, submerged in the dreamless stasis of a Susan membrane coma. He had faced the future of Orkish warfare and broken it, but the cost was a part of himself he would never get back. In the swirling confusion, a small, unassuming shuttle lifted from a hidden launch pad deep within Ork territory. It was piloted by mech boy Grokkit. With him were a handful of his spanners and 4 knobs, their modified armor scarred and sparking, but functional. No one noticed them leave. The Imperium was too busy celebrating its victory. They were a loose thread, a forgotten detail in the grand tapestry of the battle. But Grokkit carried with him the most dangerous prize of all, the crude data slates and parchments upon which Grimskull had insisted he document his work. The knowledge had survived. Inquisitor Vance took command of the aftermath. She had no interest in celebrating. Her agents moved with cold purpose, their orders absolute. Every suit of captured Ork-modified armor was to be recovered and subjected to destructive analysis. They were not studied. They were unmade, broken down to their component atoms in plasma furnaces to ensure not a single contaminated circuit survived. The machine spirits, tormented by their defilement, were given their final rites of release. The knowledge of how Grokkit had achieved the impossible was to be erased from existence. The Imperial factions descended into a predictable squabble over the spoils of war. The Iron Hands demanded custody of the technology, arguing it must be understood. The Black Templars demanded it be burned as heresy. The Mechanicus did both, simultaneously insisting the technology be destroyed while trying to secretly study it. Vance, meanwhile, began her investigation, hunting for traitors or data leaks that might explain the Orks' impossible leap in sophistication. But they were all focused on the wrong things. They didn't know about the little shuttle that had slipped through their cordon. They didn't know about the data slates. And they didn't know that reports were already flooding in from astropathic choirs across the system. New Ork fleets, dozens of them, were converging on Hexaplex Majoris. They weren't remnants of Grimskull's forces. They were other tribes, other war bands, drawn by the psychic echo of the wah, by the impossible rumors of a boss who wore a Terminator's skin. They were coming not to fight, but to see, to learn. Vance stood over the glowing pit where the last of Grimskull's armor was rendered to slag. By every military metric, the operation was a success. The warboss was dead. His army was broken. But the idea he had unleashed, the belief he had planted in the fertile soil of the Orkish psyche, was now spreading like a wildfire. The question was no longer whether Orks could wear space marine armor. The question was what the galaxy would do now that they all knew they could. Grokket's escape vessel was a masterpiece of Orkish desperation, a shuttle that was less a machine and more a collection of scrap metal and broken dreams, held together by sheer, stubborn belief. On board were 7 Orks, Grokket himself, 4 of Grimskull's knobs, their modified armor sparking and dented but miraculously still functioning, and 2 of Grokket's most trusted spanners, their faces a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Deep within the shuttle's gut, nestled in a reinforced crate, was the true prize. The data slates, the crudely drawn schematics, the physical records of every success and failure in the armor modification project. Grimskull's legacy, the journey through the hexaplex system, was a masterclass in not getting vaporized. Imperial patrols crisscrossed the void, hungry for stragglers. Grokket's shuttle had all the firepower of a spitball and the speed of a startled brick. So the mech boy relied on cunning. He ran silent through asteroid fields, hid in the shadow of drifting debris, and occasionally vented plasma from a non-critical system just to create a confusing energy signature somewhere else. The shuttle's engine coughed and sputtered. Its life support flickered, but it flew. It flew because every Ork aboard, from Grokket to the terrified spanners, believed with every fiber of their being that it had to fly. The wee field did the rest, nudging probability, ignoring physics, and keeping the rust bucket from disintegrating. Orks do not mourn. Death is just a thing that happens, usually to someone else. But as Grokket guided his ship through the darkness, he felt a strange hollowness. Grimskull wasn't just another boss. He was a boss with a plan. A 5-head who saw a future beyond the next fight. The armor wasn't just about making one Ork stronger. It was about making all Orks stronger, forever. The dream was too big to die with the dreamer. Grokket clutched the controls, his new purpose crystallizing. He would find another boss. He would share the knowledge. He would finish what Grimskull started. The battle was lost, but the war for the future of the species had just begun. They weren't the only ones who had escaped. Dozens of other Ork vessels, crewed by opportunists, cowards, and rivals, had slipped through the Imperial net. They all carried the same story, a story that would mutate and grow with every telling. A warboss wore Terminator armor. A warboss fought a Yumi captain to a standstill. The armor worked. The story was out. A virus of belief spreading through the psychic channels of the greenskin race. Then, a new opportunity presented itself. One of the wounded knobs, a brute named Gitsmasha, finally succumbed to his injuries, his massive body slumping inside its ceramite shell. The other Orks grunted, already considering who got his teeth. But Grokket saw something else. He saw proof. The stories were good, but stories could be disbelieved. An actual physical suit of modified armor, still functional, still stained with the ichor of its dead wearer. That was an argument you couldn't ignore. Their destination was a colossal space hulk, a graveyard of ships fused together over millennia, drifting at the system's edge. It was the domain of a freebooter captain named Rotgut the Sneaky, a warboss who had watched the Hexaplex War from a safe distance, waiting to see who won. Grokket's shuttle docked, and he was brought before the cunning warboss. Grokket didn't offer teeth or promises of a good fight. He had his spanners haul in the body of Gitsmasha, the dead knob still encased in his armor. He laid the offering at Rotgut's feet. "The stories are true," Grokket grunted. "This is how we take everything." Rotgut circled the armored corpse, his piggy eyes alight with a dangerous, calculating greed. He ran a clawed hand over the crude welds and the defaced Imperial iconography. He could hear the faint hum of the armor's power pack, still active. A new partnership was being forged. The seed had found new, fertile ground. In the aftermath of the battle, a silence more terrifying than any war cry descended upon Hexaplex Majoris. It was the silence of the Inquisition. With Grimskull's death confirmed, control of the entire incident was seized by Inquisitor Vance, her success on the battlefield earning her the grim authority to manage the fallout. A galaxy-wide suppression effort began, a systematic campaign to erase a dangerous truth from existence. Every Imperial survivor who had witnessed an Ork wearing modified armor, from the lowest guardsman to the highest-ranking Astartes, was subjected to memory modification. Their experiences were scoured, their recollections rewritten, their certainty replaced with a vague, state-sanctioned confusion. Every pit capture, every Vox log, every after-action report was classified at levels that made them functionally non-existent. And every piece of captured Ork-modified armor, a treasure trove of heretical innovation, was not studied, but scheduled for absolute annihilation, its atoms to be scattered lest they whisper their secrets to a curious tech priest. Vance's operatives understood that a vacuum of information is as dangerous as the truth itself, so they filled it. A new official narrative was meticulously constructed and disseminated through proper channels. The Hexaplex Majoris incursion was a standard, if unusually large, Ork raid. Warboss Grimskull was an exceptionally cunning brute, but a brute nonetheless, whose threat was contained and eliminated through conventional, glorious Imperial tactics. The reports of armored greenskins, combat stress, misidentification of crude Ork mega armor, the tragic hallucinations of heroes pushed beyond their limits. The lie was simple, plausible, and profoundly comforting. But truth is a resilient thing. The suppression was too vast, the number of witnesses too great. Some minds, forged in the crucible of absolute faith, resisted the psychic scrubbing, leaving behind fractured memories that felt more real than the bland story that replaced them. Some soldiers had already spoken, sending private messages through encrypted channels, whispering in hushed barracks, conversations about what they had truly seen. The information was already leaking, a contaminant that could never be fully purged. The greatest resistance, however, came from within the Imperium's own labyrinthine power structure. Magos Explorator Helix 9, the analyst who had first theorized the scale of the Wah field's potential, had compiled decades of research. Vance demanded his data vaults be surrendered and sanctified with plasma. The Adeptus Mechanicus refused. They argued that understanding the enemy's methods was the only logical path to victory. To destroy knowledge, even heretical knowledge, was anathema to the cult of the machine. The conflict between the Inquisition's doctrine of suppression and the Mechanicum's veneration of information escalated, a perfect microcosm of the Imperium's self-defeating nature. Ultimately, it was all irrelevant. The entire Imperial effort addressed only one side of the equation. While Vance's agents were busy rewriting human memories, millions of Orks across the galaxy were telling stories. They didn't need Imperial records. They had the testimony of their own kind. The Way field, that great and terrible engine of reality, responds to Orkish belief, not human censorship. And across 1,000 worlds, Orks were beginning to believe. In a sterile briefing room, Vance delivered her report to her superiors. She spoke of success, of a contained threat, of restored order. She carefully worded her recommendations for continued monitoring of Ork technological development, framing it as routine vigilance. They approved, satisfied that the crisis was over, another Xenos threat put down. Vance knew better. The suppression effort would succeed only in making the Imperium ignorant. Future commanders would walk into Ork engagements blind, their tactical manuals missing the most important chapter. Later, alone in her sanctum, Vance reviewed her personal files one last time before they were consigned to the incinerator. She had won. She had done her duty. But she had not stopped the idea. The knowledge that an Ork could wear the armor of a God Emperor's angel was no longer a theory. It was a story. And a story, once told, can never truly be untold. It was out in the universe, a seed of belief planted in the fertile ground of the Orkish psyche. And it was already beginning to grow. 6 months after the fires of Hexaplex Majoris had cooled to embers, a new kind of fire was spreading through the Orkish underworld. It was the fire of knowledge, and its chief arsonist was Mech Boy Grocket. He was no longer just a clever mechanic. He was a prophet. His reputation, built on the impossible feat of armoring Grimskull, had traveled faster than any Ork fleet. Warbosses who once would have dismissed his claims as the ravings of a mad mech now sent emissaries, their ships laden with teeth and scrap, begging for an audience. A typical demonstration was a masterpiece of Orkish theater. Before a conclave of hulking, skeptical knobs, Grocket would unveil his prize. The suit of modified power armor recovered from the Knob, who died during their escape. It was battered, scarred, and still stained with its former wearer's ichor. But it was real. Grocket would then deliver his sermon, a lesson so simple it was revolutionary. "You make it bigger," he'd grunt, pointing to the expanded torso. "You rip out the thinky bits and put in proper levers," he'd say, gesturing at the crude mechanical linkages. "You paint onto killy signs," he'd conclude, tapping a glyph for toughness. And then, he'd fix them with a knowing glare. "You tell it what to do. You gotta believe it's gonna work. If you don't, it'll squash you flat." The lesson was a gross oversimplification of the technical marvels he'd achieved, but it was exactly what the Orkish mind needed to hear. It was practical, it was direct, and it was already working. Across the segmentum, in scrap heaps and looted workshops, other mech boys were trying. Most attempts ended in catastrophic, often comical failure. Crushed grots, exploding power plants, and suits that simply seized up and refused to move. But some, a precious and growing number, succeeded. And each success proved that Grimskull's achievement was not a fluke, it was a formula. The proof came from a distant system, where a warboss named Bloodgut the Crusher, having heard the stories, had armed 3 of his elite knobs. Their armor was a crude parody of Grocket's work, but it functioned. When they engaged a patrol of space marines, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The knobs were slain, their armor torn to shreds. But the survivors of the battle told a story that electrified every Ork who heard it. For a few glorious, violent moments, Orks in Umi armor had gone toe-to-toe with the Emperor's finest. Even in defeat, the legend grew. This was the terrifying feedback loop of the Wa field. Success, no matter how small, bred belief. Belief made the next attempt more likely to succeed. The collective expectation of an entire species was shifting, raising the baseline of what was considered possible. Grocket, however, was playing a longer game. He wasn't just a teacher. He was becoming an institution. He began formally training apprentices, creating repeatable methods, establishing a central workshop that functioned as a pilgrimage site for ambitious mechs. It was a concept alien to the Orkish psyche, which valued individual glory over collective progress. His students often left before their training was complete, and his methods were warped as they passed from clan to clan. But it didn't matter. Enough of the core idea survived. The future Grimskull had only dreamed of, Grocket was now methodically constructing, bolt by agonizing bolt. He was building an Ork species that could learn, that could accumulate knowledge, that could build upon the successes of its ancestors. The question was no longer if an Ork could wear space marine armor. The real question was What would happen to a galaxy when every Ork knew they could? 5 years. In the endless grind of the 41st millennium, it was both a lifetime and a heartbeat. For the Imperium, it was long enough to declare the Hexaplex Majoris incident a victory, to file the reports, and to allow the institutional memory to fade. For the Orks, it was long enough for a seed to become a forest. Across 3 segmentums, in 17 different star systems, the reports trickled in. At first, they were dismissed as battlefield anomalies, a single, unusually durable Ork knob in a raiding party. Then came sightings of entire squads, fighting in crude but effective ceramite shells. Each incident was contained. Each armored Ork was eventually killed. But the pattern was undeniable. The infection was spreading. In a sterile office high in an inquisitorial spire, a woman who had once been Inquisitor Vance was now Inquisitor Lord Vance. Her promotion was a reward for her success at Hexaplex Majoris, a success she now knew was a complete and utter failure. Her new role was not to fight, but to watch. She managed a vast, clandestine network of agents, their sole purpose to track the spread of Orkish technological adaptation. It was a thankless, soul-crushing task. She was a physician charting the progress of an incurable disease, bailing water from a ship whose hull was riddled with holes, each one punched by the power of greenskin belief. Her briefings were a litany of defeat disguised as data. The armor modification techniques had gone feral, evolving in the wild, spreading faster than any agent could track. A case study from the Kraken Nebula landed on her desk, a perfect microcosm of the nightmare. An Ork way, led by a brute named Scarfung, had thrown itself against a Deathwatch watch fortress. A suicidal attack by any measure. The Deathwatch, the elite of the elite, had annihilated the Ork forces. But intelligence gathered from the wreckage revealed the attack's insane purpose. Scarfung wasn't trying to win. He was trying to loot. Specifically, he was after Terminator armor. Interrogated survivors spoke of the legend that now echoed through Ork society, the stories about DeBoss who wore gold. Grimskull's ghost was now a motivating force for Was, 1,000 light-years away. The psychological impact was beginning to show. Space Marine after-action reports now included a new variable, the possibility of armored Ork elites, captains who once charged Ork lines with the absolute certainty of their superiority, now hesitated. That half-second of caution, of re-evaluating the threat, was getting Astartes killed. The Imperium's greatest strength had been its faith in its own technological supremacy. That faith was cracking. The Adeptus Mechanicus, ever reactive, was developing countermeasures. New bolt rounds designed to punch through the weak points in Orkish welts. Auspec scanners calibrated to detect the strange energy signatures of powered armor. There were even whispers of experimental weapons that could project null fields, disrupting the psychic energy the Orks relied on. But these were all treatments for the symptoms. No one knew how to cure the disease. Late one cycle, Vance reviewed the casualty logs. The list of Astartes confirmed killed by Orks in modified power armor. The total number was still small, statistically insignificant against the backdrop of galactic war. But it wasn't the number that chilled her. It was the trend line. It only went up. The problem was not getting better. It was accelerating. Years ago, she had been part of the team that answered a single, heretical question. The answer had been yes. Now, alone in her office, surrounded by the evidence of that answer's consequences, she understood the truth. That first question was irrelevant. The real questions were the ones that followed. How far will they go? What other sacred technologies will they claim as their own? And is there any strategy, any weapon, any force left in the galaxy that can realistically stop them? Vance didn't have the answers, And the most terrifying part was, she was beginning to suspect that no one did. Grocket, now a name of legend whispered among mech boys across 1,000 worlds, had achieved what even Grimskull had only dared to dream. In a workshop built from the ruins of a conquered forge, he had completed his masterpiece. It was a dreadnought chassis, the sacred walking tomb of a fallen space marine, and it was now hideously, blasphemously, gloriously Orky. The project should have been impossible. A dreadnought's systems demanded an intimate, life-sustaining neural link that far exceeded the simple mechanics of power armor. But Grocket, armed with Grimskull's philosophy and a way hungry for miracles, had found a way. The first deployment of the Ork Dread was a massacre. The machine was a walking blasphemy, its original form buried under layers of bolted-on scrap plating, spiked protrusions, and guns that spat fire and metal with equal abandon. Its pilot was not a hero entombed in honor, but a knob, Gashrak One-Eye, who had been torn nearly in half during the Hexaplex siege. He should have died, but the Wah had decided otherwise. Wired directly into the machine's corrupted systems, his mangled body was kept alive by the sheer, stubborn belief that orcs don't die unless they're done fighting. The dreadnought, piloted by a barely living orc, tore through Imperial guard lines like a storm of shrapnel, its crude cannons reducing tanks to slag, while its massive claw arms swatted away infantry. This wasn't an isolated incident. The idea had gone viral. Across the galaxy, mech boys inspired by Grocket's legend were turning their attention to bigger and better scrap. Modified rhino transports, now called tracks, belched black smoke as they carried orc assault teams deep into enemy lines. Converted land speeders, little more than engines with guns bolted on, provided crude but shockingly effective air support. There were even reports of orc vessels incorporating salvaged Imperial lance batteries, their systems jury-rigged to function through a combination of grots, squigs, and pure, unadulterated confidence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in its cold, logical terror, concluded that orcish technological capability was experiencing exponential growth. Each success didn't just add to their arsenal, it multiplied their potential. Projections, buried under layers of classification, suggested that within a few centuries, the orcs might be capable of looting and operating virtually any piece of Imperial technology they could get their hands on. But a few radical tech priests, their research branded as heresy, whispered of a far greater danger. The Wah field didn't just make existing technology function. It had the potential to make impossible technology function. If an orc believed truly and deeply that a broken machine should work, the universe would conspire to make it so. And what if they got their hands on technology that humans themselves couldn't understand? The proof came from a backwater war zone, from a war boss named Grotzmasha the Unlimited. He had looted a piece of archaeotech, a weapon from humanity's lost golden age, so advanced and alien that no living magos could even identify its purpose. It was a dead artifact, a museum piece. But in Grotzmasha's hands it wasn't. He simply believed it was a gun. And so, it became one. With no visible power source, no discernible firing mechanism, the weapon discharged blasts of pure entropy that erased whatever they touched. The Wah had made the impossible real. The knowledge terrified the few inquisitors who learned of it. Humanity's greatest technological treasures, the legacy of their brightest age, were safer in a trash heap than in the hands of an orc who believed they could be used. In his own workshop, Grocket was already moving on. He stood before his next project, the scavenged components of a Warhound Titan's plasma reactor, the heart of a god machine. His fellow mechs looked on, shaking their heads, muttering that it was too big, too complex, too much. Grocket just grinned, his metal jaw clicking. He remembered the words of his old boss, the words that started it all. "Impossible," he grunted, tapping a massive conduit with his power claw. "Just means we ain't tried hard enough yet." The highest governing body of the Imperium of Man, the Senatorum Imperialis, convened an emergency session. On Holy Terra itself, beneath the suffocating weight of 10,000 years of history, the High Lords gathered to address a threat that had finally, undeniably, spun out of control. The subject was not a rebellion, not a new chaos incursion, but something far more insidious. Lord Commander Raboot Guilliman himself had designated it a strategic crisis of the first magnitude. The subject was the Orks. Before the assembled lords, evidence was presented in a cascade of horror. Reports from 100 war zones, data streams from 1,000 Mechanicum outposts, and Vox intercepts from 1,000,000 battles all told the same story. Orkish technological capability, a factor that had remained brutishly stagnant for millennia, had improved more in the past decade than it had in the previous 1,000 years. Projections, once dismissed as alarmist fantasy, now painted scenarios of total strategic collapse. If the current trend continued, the Imperium's technological superiority, the single pillar holding up the entire edifice of human dominance, would be gone within 2 centuries. The response was a masterclass in institutional paralysis. The representative of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his voice a synthesized drone of stubborn dogma, insisted that technology could not be made to work through belief alone. The field reports had to be exaggerations, the data corrupted, the observers mistaken. To admit otherwise was to deny the fundamental truth of the machine god. The inquisitorial representative, predictable as a sunrise, argued for what the Inquisition always argues for: expanded suppression. More mind wipes, more classified documents, more executions. If no one was allowed to know about the problem, then for all intents and purposes, the problem did not exist. The Lord Militant of the Astra Militarum and the Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum simply demanded more resources, their focus locked on the immediate fires they had to put out, blind to the galaxy-spanning inferno that was building. Only Guilliman seemed to grasp the full, terrifying scope of the crisis. The returned Primarch, with a mind forged for galactic conquest, saw what the others, in their specialized arrogance, could not. The Imperium's entire strategy for fighting the greenskin menace had been built on a single, unspoken assumption: that human technology would always be better. That one space marine was worth 100 orcs because his armor was superior, his bolter more reliable, his systems more advanced. If that assumption was no longer valid, then the math of the Imperium's survival no longer worked. The Lord Commander listened to the desperate proposals. Voices called for galaxy-wide exterminatus campaigns, for the scouring of every known orc world. Others, in hushed and heretical tones, suggested alliances with the Eldar or the Tau against the common green enemy. It was the sound of an empire beginning to panic. Finally, Guilliman acted. He authorized a sweeping expansion of anti-orc operations with new directives: specifically target and eliminate mech boys and their workshops. He established new research divisions within the military, tasked with studying the Wach field, overriding the Mechanicum's furious, blasphemous objections. And he began drafting contingency plans for a future that was once unthinkable, a future where orcs possessed technology equal to, or even greater than, that of the Imperium. Later, in the quiet of his private chambers, Guilliman met with Inquisitor Lord Vance. He thanked her for her prescient warnings, acknowledging that her analysis, dismissed for years, had proven catastrophically accurate. Then he asked her a question a Primarch should never have to ask a mortal. "Can this be recovered? Can we win?" Vance's answer was stripped of all hope or pretense. She did not know. The problem wasn't the Orks' technology, it was their belief. As long as Orks believed they could loot and operate human systems, they would. To change that would require not just a military victory, but the psychological re-engineering of an entire species. A feat the Imperium had never once accomplished. After she left, Guilliman stood alone, the weight of 1,000,000 worlds on his shoulders. He had faced down his traitor brothers. He had survived 10,000 years in stasis. He had returned to an Imperium on the very brink of collapse and held it together through sheer, indomitable will. But this was different. This was a war not against armies or fleets, but against an idea. What happens when your enemy's faith proves more powerful than your engineering? What do you do when belief itself becomes the ultimate weapon? For the first time in his impossibly long life, the Lord Commander of the Imperium of Man did not have an answer. On a nameless, dust-choked world at the galactic rim, the Great Gathering was underway. Such convocations happened, from time to time, when a Wa grew large enough to attract other Orks. But this was different. This was not a prelude to a simple war. It was a declaration, a statement of what the greenskin race had become. Warbosses from 100 tribes, weird boys whose eyes leaked green lightning, and mech boys reeking of ozone and hot metal had come from across the segmentum. They had come to see and to be seen. The main event was a parade of pure, orky one-upmanship. Warbosses marched their elite knobs past a reviewing stand made from a crashed Imperial lander, each tribe competing to display the most impressive armored warriors. Here, the Bad Moons showed off armor plated in gold teeth, its power systems humming erratically. There, the Evil Suns presented suits painted a blinding red, their leg servos modified for reckless speed over stability. The Death Skulls, naturally, had the most varied collection, a patchwork of different armor, marks looted from a dozen battlefields, each painted a lucky blue. The sophistication varied wildly, from crude metal boxes welded onto a knobs frame to intricate conversions that almost rivaled Grocket's original work. But beneath the competitive bluster, a fundamental change was taking place. Orks had always craved power, but it had always been a personal, selfish pursuit. Now, for the first time, they were building on each other's work. They were creating something that resembled collective progress. The proof came in the form of a young mech boy named Scragget. He presented a suit with a novel modification, a system of interlocking plates and reinforced pistons at the joints that dramatically improved an armored Ork's mobility. In the past, such an innovation would have been a jealously guarded secret, or it would have earned Scragget a fatal challenge from a rival mech. Instead, a crowd of other mech boys gathered, poking and prodding the design with unusual focus. They grunted, they argued, but some were seen openly admitting they would incorporate the idea into their own work. Knowledge was being shared. It was unprecedented. It was un-Orky. And it was terrifyingly effective. The sheer concentration of ambition and belief was a psychic beacon. A weird boy near the center of the gathering screamed, his head thrown back as the "Wah!" field overloaded his senses. He saw visions, chaotic and fleeting. He saw Orks in the black armor of the Death Watch, striding through the halls of an inquisitorial fortress. He saw greenskin pilots in the cockpits of Imperial Titans, their minds crudely wired into the machine spirits. He saw the Imperium not falling to a single glorious battle, but slowly, inexorably eroding, its technological pillars pulled out from under it one by one. The vision was unreliable, tainted by Orkish wishful thinking, but it resonated with a deep, cellular certainty that now permeated the entire species. The gathering reached its climax. A new war boss was needed, one to lead a unified Wah! That would put all this new power to the test. The biggest and strongest war bosses postured, roaring challenges and brandishing their weapons. But the crowd's attention kept drifting away from them, settling instead on a single, unassuming figure. He was not the largest. He was not the most violent. He was a mech boy. Through a slow, dawning, unanimous acclaim, the title was given to Grocket. His vision, his role in spreading Grimskull's legacy, had earned him a status that raw strength never could. They had chosen their chief engineer to be their king. Grocket accepted the title with the practicality that defined him. He climbed atop the reviewing stand, his own modified mega armor a testament to his craft. He surveyed the roaring sea of green faces, a species reborn. "Right then," he grunted into the Vox. "Let's go show to Yumis what we've learned." The wah began. The change in the greenskin tide was no longer a secret confined to classified Imperial data vaults. A tremor was running through the galaxy, a shift in the fundamental balance of power felt by every race old enough to have a memory. The Orks were becoming something new, and the galaxy was beginning to take notice. On the gossamer-thin craft worlds of the Eldar, Farseers screamed themselves awake in their crystal domes. Their scrying had always shown the Orks as a blunt instrument, a chaotic but predictable disaster. Now, the skeins of fate were tangled with new, horrifying possibilities. They saw futures where greenskins, clad in stolen ceramite, navigated the secret paths of the webway. They saw Ork mech boys reverse engineering Wraithbone. In their panicked councils, the Eldar debated their response. Some argued for immediate, overwhelming strikes against the Orks' burgeoning tech hubs, a surgical purge to cauterize the infection. But others, paralyzed by millennia of caution, warned that such direct action could backfire, providing the Orks with a new, more sophisticated enemy to learn from, accelerating their evolution. In the end, they settled on their usual tragic course: observation and targeted intervention, a measured response to a threat that was anything but. In the swirling madness of the Imperium, the Chaos Gods watched with detached amusement. Khorne cared little for how his skulls were collected, but Tzeentch, the great schemer, was utterly fascinated. The Wa field was a form of reality warping that operated on principles similar to his own, a raw, primal force of belief. The potential for manipulation was intoxicating. A warband of his chosen 1,000 sons was dispatched, attempting to subtly corrupt mech-boy designs, to weave warp-tainted sigils into the Orks' armor modifications. The hope was to turn their creations into conduits for demonic possession. The plan failed spectacularly. The Orks' psychology was too simple, too direct. Their belief system was a closed loop, a psychic sledgehammer with no room for the delicate whispers of chaos. They were, in their own brutish way, incorruptible. For the burgeoning Tau Empire, the news was an existential crisis. The Tau had carved out their small corner of the galaxy through technological supremacy, winning battles against numerically superior foes with better guns and smarter tactics. The idea of an enemy that could simply steal that superiority, that could loot a railgun and make it work through sheer stubbornness, was a threat to the very foundation of the greater good. Their ethereal councils authorized a massive expansion of research into Xenos phenomena, dispatching Earth-caste scientists to study the Wug field, desperate to understand, replicate, or nullify this impossible advantage. But it was the Necrons who had the longest and most terrifying perspective. From their silent tomb worlds, ancient overlords stirred, their cogitators analyzing the new data with cold, passionless logic. They had seen this before. 60 million years ago, they had fought a species called the Krork, a race of hyper-intelligent, technologically advanced greenskin warriors engineered by the old ones to be the perfect weapon. The modern Orks were their devolved, degenerate descendants. And now, they were starting to remember. On the throne of the Sautek dynasty, an overlord examined a piece of captured Ork-modified armor. Wiping away the crude paint, its optical sensors traced the lines of a power conduit. The pattern was not random. It was a degraded but recognizable echo of a Krork energy distribution network, a design preserved in genetic memory across 60 million years of barbarism. The Orks weren't just adapting, they were reawakening. The strategic calculations that had governed the galaxy for 10 millennia were obsolete. Every faction now had to plan for an Ork. Wah! That might be armored, that might wield stolen technology, that might be capable of anything. The question that had begun this entire nightmare, can Orks wear space marine armor, was now laughably small. The real question, whispered in the war councils of a dozen different species, was much, much worse. What can't they wear? Inquisitor Lord Helena Vance had grown old, not ancient, not by the augmented standards of the Imperium's elite, but old in a way that mattered more. The decades of her war against an idea had worn her down, etching lines of failure into her face and silvering her hair with the dust of lost battles. In the quiet solitude of her scriptorium, she prepared one last report. This one was not for the Senatorum, nor the High Lords. This was for the darkness, for the secret archives only her successors would ever read, a final testament to a truth the Imperium refused to see. Her pen scratched across the parchment, summarizing a lifetime of struggle. Her first conclusion was the most fundamental. The Way field was not a mere psychic quirk. It was a primordial force of the universe, a law of reality as potent as gravity, one that responded to the raw, unified power of belief. The Orks didn't just bend the rules, they played a different game entirely. Her second conclusion followed with grim inevitability. Orkish technological capability had no upper limit. Given enough conviction and enough time, they could claim any technology, no matter how complex or sacred. The Imperium's most powerful weapons were simply future salvage for the green-skin tide. This led to her third and most damning point. The Imperium's technological superiority, the very bedrock of human survival for 10,000 years, was nothing more than a temporary advantage. And it was an advantage that would, without question, eventually erode completely. Vance paused, her gaze drifting to a star chart that depicted the encroaching green stains of Ork-held territory. She allowed herself a moment to reflect on what might have been. If they had listened at Hexaplex Majoris, if the Mechanicum had sought to understand rather than deny, if Grimskull had been stopped before his legend could ignite 1 billion brutish minds. But the Imperium was not built for adaptation. Its institutions were fortresses designed to preserve the status quo, to suppress dangerous knowledge, to assume that the enemies of today would be the enemies of tomorrow, unchanged. The Imperium's greatest strength, its stability, had become its fatal flaw. With a deep breath, she wrote her most dangerous thought, a heresy born from decades of watching the conventional fail. The Imperium might have to learn from the Orks. If belief was a weapon, then humanity had to learn to wield it. The rituals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the prayers of the Imperial Guard, the faith of the common citizen, perhaps these were not just superstitions. Perhaps they were the faint, unconscious echoes of humanity's own Wah field, a power that could be honed, focused, and weaponized. Understanding this might be the only hope for keeping pace. She thought of the colleagues she had lost, the agents sacrificed, the personal relationships that had withered in the shadow of her all-consuming duty. She did not regret her choices. The knowledge she was recording might save a world, a sector, a generation, even if it could not save her own. But she mourned the galaxy that could have been, a universe where Grimskull the Magnificent had remained just another Ork, and the question at the heart of her life's work had never been asked, let alone answered. Her final entry was for herself as much as for any successor. She remembered the reports from Hexaplex, Majoris, the single moment that had changed everything. A war boss, driven by nothing but ambition, laying a hand on a piece of ceramite, and the armor, against all logic and law, responding to his belief. That instant had proven that the rules of the universe were far more flexible than the Imperium wanted to believe. It proved that determination could reshape reality. She dipped her pen one last time. Can Orks wear Space Marine armor? Yes. They can wear anything they believe they can wear. And belief, unlike material, cannot be suppressed, cannot be destroyed, cannot be contained. We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting an idea. And ideas, once planted, grow. Vance sealed the report with the sigil of her office. She rose, her old bones aching, and placed the document into the stasis vault. One more warning for a future that would likely never read it until it was far too late. The new Wah fell upon the segmentum solar like a hammer blow. Its target was not some isolated agri-world or secondary outpost. Its target was Metallica, the Iron Heart, a forge world whose defenses were the stuff of legend, whose Titan legions were a promise of imperial might. For any Ork Warboss of the old ways, attacking Metallica would have been a glorious and very short suicide run. But this was not a Wah of the old ways. This was Grokket's crusade. Imperial defenders, arrayed in battle lines, perfected over 10,000 years of war, prepared for the familiar green tide. They expected waves of howling savages, a wall of bodies to be ground down by disciplined fire. What they got was a coordinated assault. Ork forces, moving with a brutal but undeniable logic, exploited weaknesses in the defensive grid that had been theoretical vulnerabilities just hours before. The attack wasn't just a charge, it was a plan. The true horror came with the spearhead. Squads of Orks clad in ceramite, their stolen armor painted in garish clan colors, smashed into positions designed to repel unarmored greenskins. They weathered bolter fire that would have shredded their brethren and went toe-to-toe with Skitarii maniples, trading blows with augmented soldiers in a parody of Astartes combat. From the smoke and fire of the battlefield, new mech-boy innovations emerged. Crude but terrifyingly effective anti-Titan weaponry, reverse-engineered from captured Imperial tech and supercharged by the Wah, brought down war engines that had stood unbowed for centuries. Grokket himself led from the front, a testament to the new Ork paradigm. He was no physical giant like Grimskull, no legend of the fighting pits. He was a mech boy, his body built for crafting, not combat, but encased in a suit of mega armor that was a rolling collage of scavenged Imperial systems, parts of a dreadnought, a Leman Russ, and even a Nightwalker, all hammered together. He was a god of war. He was formidable not because of his strength, but because of his intellect, made manifest in a shell of stolen steel. The battle for Metallica became a meat grinder, but one where the Orks were no longer the only ones being ground. Standard Ork boys still died in their millions, a carpet of green flesh for the elite to advance over. But they died with purpose, supporting armored squads and vehicle formations that functioned with a nightmarish reliability. They were a tide, yes, but a tide with a tip of sharpened, stolen steel. The climax came when Grokket and his chosen knobs breached the defenses of Metallica's central manufactorum, the hallowed production lines that forged the armor for a dozen Space Marine chapters. He stood amidst the sterile, sacred assembly lines, the air thick with the smell of ozone and ork. He placed a metal hand on a half-finished Aquila chest plate, the machine spirit within, screaming at his profane touch. He looked at the endless rows of technology he had spent a lifetime learning to claim, and spoke the words that would echo across 1,000 Ork campfires. The boss said we could take anything. He was right. They did not conquer Metallica. They could not. The Iron Heart was too strong, its defenders too numerous. But conquest was never the goal. The We extracted, its ships heavy with plunder. They had not just taken armor. They had taken the means of its creation. Production templates, cogitator cores, entire assembly servitors, the keys to the kingdom. The damage to Imperial production would echo for decades. On Terra, Lord Guilliman received the reports with a grim stillness. This was the future he had foreseen, the logical endpoint of the crisis that began at Hexaplex Majoris. He authorized expanded operations, knowing they were now merely slowing a transformation that could no longer be stopped. As Grocket's fleet vanished back into the void, the warboss surveyed his prizes with a satisfaction that bordered on pure joy. Grimskull's dream was not just alive, it was thriving, it was growing, it was becoming the new reality that would reshape the galaxy, and this was only the beginning. In the silent, data-haunted vaults of Terra, strategic analysts and sanctioned prophets game out the future. They feed the events of Hexaplex Majoris and Metallica into cogitator engines the size of cathedrals, seeking to map the decades and centuries to come. The projections that flicker to life on their hololithic displays are not comforting. They are a spectrum of doom, ranging from the merely catastrophic to the utterly apocalyptic. The most optimistic scenario, codenamed the Stalwart Response, posits that the Imperium can adapt. It shows a future where Imperial adaptation keeps pace with Orkish development. In this timeline, Astartes chapters rewrite entire doctrines of war. They fight alongside new formations of Skitarii, armed with specialized rifles designed to short out crude Orkish cybernetics. The Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus, working in a rare and strained partnership, develop countermeasures that disrupt the Wa field on a localized level. The balance of power shifts, the cost of every victory rises, but the Imperium does not collapse. It survives, as it has always survived, through monumental sacrifice and the grim determination to simply endure one more day. The war is bloodier, the losses are higher, but the line holds. Then there is the moderate scenario, the slow decay. In these projections, Orkish capability continues to outpace the Imperium's institutional inertia. The technological gap that has protected humanity for 10,000 years slowly, inexorably, closes. Forge worlds fall one by one, each loss a fresh injection of advanced materials and templates into the greenskin ecosystem. Wars that were once costly become unwinnable. The Imperium endures, but it diminishes. Its territories shrink, its fleets dwindle, its power wanes. Across the galaxy, the green stain of Ork influence expands, a slow creeping tide that erodes the foundations of human dominion. And finally, there is the projection that keeps the analysts awake in the cold dark of the Terran night. The pessimistic scenario, the green ascension. This future shows Ork technological adaptation reaching a singularity, a tipping point where no Imperial response can possibly contain it. It shows greenskin forces equipped with technology functionally identical to, or even superior to, humanity's own. It shows Ork titans, their hulls no longer patchwork scrap, but seamless sheets of adamantium, striding through the ruins of human civilization. These are not the clumsy, comical machines of old. They are terrible engines of destruction, powered by belief and more frightening than anything humanity ever built for that very reason. In this future, the Imperium collapses from the edges inward, until only Terra itself remains, a final, defiant bastion against a galaxy that is no longer man's. Of course, these projections are flawed. The future is never fixed. The analysts cannot account for the 1,000 other variables in a hostile galaxy. The Tyranid hive fleets could devour all. The Necrons could awaken in force. The forces of chaos could finally break the gates of reality. But within the narrow confines of the Ork-human conflict, one final, heretical possibility circulates in suppressed data files. A thought so dangerous it is spoken only in whispers by the most radical of inquisitors and magos biologists. What if humanity could learn from the Orks? What if the collective faith of a quadrillion souls, the fervent, ceaseless worship of the God Emperor, was its own kind of vague field, waiting to be consciously weaponized? Perhaps the fusion of technology and faith that the Mechanicum practices unknowingly could become a conscious, directed discipline. It is a desperate, blasphemous hope. But it may be the only one humanity has left. The story is not over. The question that began this saga has been answered. But the answers to the questions that now follow, can they be stopped? Can humanity adapt, remain terrifyingly unknown? The question, in the end, was simple. Can orcs wear space marine armor? The answer, demonstrated through blood and fire across 100 worlds, is unequivocally yes. Orcs can, and do, wear space marine armor. They have worn it in the heart of battle, worn it in the moment of triumph, and worn it as they conquered worlds that should have been impregnable. The technological barriers that should have prevented this, the sacred black carapace interface, the complex machine-spirit protocols, the ritualistic activation sequences, have all proven utterly irrelevant in the face of raw, unyielding Orkish determination. And in that simple, terrible answer, the foundations of the galaxy have shifted. The Imperium's single greatest advantage, 10,000 years of accumulated technology, jealously guarded and reverently maintained, has been revealed as a profound vulnerability. Technology that relies on exclusivity becomes a liability when that exclusivity can no longer be guaranteed. The Imperium's most sacred weapons, the very symbols of its might, can now become its enemies' weapons, claimed through a process of sheer belief that humans cannot replicate, and a force of will they cannot prevent. This reckoning was not met without heroism. Grimskull was stopped. Captain Vero and his Ultramarines, the Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, they all paid a butcher's bill in blood to halt the immediate threat at Hexaplex Majoris. Countless other attempts at Orkish armor modification have been thwarted by the eternal vigilance of the Astartes and the Inquisition. Every world that remains free, every chapter that still fights, every forge that still produces, all represent victories against the encroaching green tide. Humanity has not surrendered. Humanity has fought, as it has always fought, with everything it possesses. But the tragedy is that the Imperium's own nature made this crisis inevitable. The very mechanisms designed to protect humanity have prevented it from truly protecting itself. Knowledge that might have helped was suppressed as heresy. Research that might have provided solutions was forbidden as dangerous. The Imperium fights its enemies with both hands tied, and the knots are of its own making. Far from the present, in a future that may yet come to pass, an imperial world burns. A desperate last stand is underway, its defenders knowing they are outmatched, but fighting anyway, because that is what humans do. And above the battlefield, watching with a satisfaction that borders on gratitude, stands an Ork Warboss. He is not Grimskull. He is not Grocket. He is their heir, their legacy, the living proof that what they began has endured. His armor gleams gold in the firelight, its form a perfect, brutal fusion of imperial design and Orkish innovation, incorporating techniques passed down through a century of development. He represents everything the Orks have become. As his Wah finally breaks the imperial lines. He speaks the words that have become the new creed of his people, an echo of a long-dead visionary. The boss was right. Anything we want, we can take. Anything we believe, we can be. The question that began this saga has become obsolete, its answer spawning 1,000 more terrifying inquiries. Can orcs wear space marine armor? Yes. Can they wear Terminator armor? Yes. Can they wear Titan armor, or Starship armor, or armor forged from technologies that humans have not even invented yet? Yes, yes, and yes. Can they be stopped? That question remains unanswered. Not because the answer is unknown, but because the answer depends entirely on what happens next. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that war, the side that believes the hardest might just be the side that wins. The answer is yes. The galaxy trembles.